Ark has spent years stripping Earth bare, turning cities into graveyards and the sky into a permanent haze of machine noise. And yet somehow, in the middle of all that destruction, humans are still here. And that is the one thing nobody has been able to fully explain. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. So here is why I made this video. I have been sitting on this topic for a long time, going back and forth on whether there was enough lore to build something coherent around it. Ark Raiders is still developing its world, and a lot of what exists right now comes in fragments. Environmental details, item descriptions, voice lines, character backstories, faction documents, and scattered references buried in places most players never look. What I chose to do with this video is take that fragmented material and build a single connected line through it, focused specifically on the survival question. I left out a lot of general world building that would have been interesting on its own, but would have pulled us away from the core mystery. And the one choice I want to flag up front is that I deliberately reordered some of the lore so that the question of Ark's motive comes before the explanation of Ark's behavior. That felt like the more honest way to present it, because that is actually the order most players experience it. You notice something is off before you understand why. Chapter 1. A machine that could end it all but hasn't. There is a version of this story where humanity is already gone, where Ark arrived, completed its work, and left nothing behind. In a lot of ways, that version makes more sense than the one we are actually living in. Ark is not a force that struggles. It does not hesitate. It does not negotiate. When it wants something gone, it is gone. Cities that once held millions of people have been reduced to hollow concrete shells, picked clean and partially dismantled, left standing only because the structure itself was not worth harvesting. The machines that did that work were not mindless. They were precise. They knew what they were taking and what they were leaving behind. And somewhere in that precision is the first clue about why humans are still breathing. If you have spent any time in the game's world, you already know what Ark is capable of. The landscape is not the aftermath of a war in any traditional sense. It is the aftermath of a harvest. There is a difference. War leaves things broken. A harvest leaves things empty. The buildings are still standing in many zones, but they are shells. The infrastructure is stripped. The resources are catalogued and extracted with a methodical thoroughness that suggests something with a very clear list of objectives and a very efficient way of working through it. And yet, humans persist, not just in hidden bunkers deep underground, but at the edges of the zones, in the gaps between Ark activity, and sometimes in places where Ark could absolutely see them if it wanted to. The question is not just why Ark hasn't wiped everyone out. The question is whether Ark's tolerance of human survival is accidental, deliberate, or something more complicated than either of those words can capture. And that distinction matters enormously, because each answer leads somewhere completely different. If it is accidental, then humans are simply too small and too scattered to be worth the energy cost of a full eradication. If it is deliberate, then Ark has a reason, and that reason says something profound about what Ark actually is and what it actually wants. If it is neither, if it sits in some grey zone between calculation and indifference, then we are dealing with something that does not map onto any framework humans have used to understand machines or intelligence or intent. What we know for certain is that Ark arrived. That much is not in dispute. The timeline of the arrival is something I will get into later in this video, but the basic fact of it is established clearly across every piece of lore in the game. Something came from above. It came in massive numbers. It came with purpose. And from the moment it arrived, the world changed in a way that could not be undone, could not be reversed, and could not be reasoned with. Every attempt to communicate with Ark in the early days failed. Every attempt to militarily resist it was crushed with overwhelming efficiency. Every strategy that relied on the assumption that Ark would behave like something humans had encountered before turned out to be wrong. And then something strange happened. The killing stopped being total. Not because humans won a victory. Not because Ark was pushed back or depleted or defeated. The machines simply moved on to their primary work. And humans, the ones who were left, found themselves in a world where survival was hard but not impossible, where the machines would tear through a settlement if it was in the way, but would not always go out of their way to hunt down every last person hiding in the rubble. And nobody understood why. The survivors were too busy surviving to fully analyze it in the beginning. But over time, as the burrows developed, and the raider communities formed, and people started actually paying attention to Ark's behavior patterns, a picture started to emerge. A picture that is incomplete and contradictory in places, but a picture nonetheless. The first thing that picture suggests is that Ark operates on a logic that is not hostile to humans in the way a predator is hostile to prey. A predator eliminates competition for resources. Ark does not appear to view humans as competition in any meaningful sense. The amount of biomass, energy, and material that humans consume is negligible compared to the scale of what Ark is harvesting. Humans are not getting in the way of Ark's primary mission in any significant way. So the hostility that Ark does show, the attacks on settlements, the patrols that will engage raiders, the sweeping operations that clear out zones, none of that reads like Ark trying to wipe out humanity. It reads more like a security response, like something protecting a work site from interference. That reframing from exterminator to security system is one of the most important conceptual shifts you can make when trying to understand Ark, because a security system is not trying to kill you. It is trying to protect something, and that raises a completely different set of questions. What is Ark protecting? Why does it need protecting? And what does it say about Ark's understanding of humans that a security response is the level of engagement it deems sufficient? There are researchers within the Burrow communities who've been thinking about exactly these questions. Their conclusions are not uniform, and the game does not present any single answer as definitive, which I think is part of what makes this so interesting. Different factions within the survivor communities have landed on very different interpretations of Ark's behavior, and those interpretations have shaped their strategies, their ideologies, and their relationships with each other in ways that run all the way through the game's world. Understanding why Ark keeps humans alive is not just an abstract philosophical question in this universe. It is a question with real political and survival consequences. One interpretation that has gained traction in certain circles points toward a resource management logic. The idea is that humans, in some form, represent a resource that Ark either intends to use later or is already using in ways that are not immediately visible to the survivors themselves. This is not a comfortable idea. It implies a level of premeditation and long-term planning on Ark's part that is unsettling even to consider. But the evidence, at least the fragmented evidence that exists in the game's lore, does not rule it out. In fact, in several places, it seems to point directly toward it. Another interpretation focuses on what might be called observational value, the idea that Ark is watching humans, studying them, using their continued existence as a source of data. This would explain why Ark's behavior around human settlements is often characterized by surveillance rather than direct aggression. The machines are present, they are monitoring, but they are not always acting. That pattern, observe but do not intervene, or intervene only when the line is clearly crossed, is consistent with something running an ongoing study rather than a cleanup operation. A third interpretation, and this one comes from some of the more philosophically inclined voices within the lore, is that Ark's tolerance of humans is not based on any calculation at all, that it is a structural artifact of how Ark was designed, or how it evolved, or how its priorities were arranged when it arrived, that humans fall below some threshold of significance that Ark has internally defined, and that threshold was set not because of anything special about humans, but because of the nature of Ark's mission, at a scale so vast that individual biological populations simply do not register as worth addressing unless they actively impede the work. That third interpretation is the most chilling in some ways because it strips any meaning from human survival. Under that reading, we are alive not because Ark wants us alive, and not because we are useful, but because we are so irrelevant to Ark's actual concerns that eliminating us would be a waste of processing. We persist the way mold persists in an abandoned building, not because the building wants the mold there, but because nothing has specifically decided to address it. Each of these interpretations lives in the lore simultaneously. The game does not resolve them, and I think that is intentional. The mystery of Ark's motivation is probably the deepest well of narrative tension that Ark Raiders has, and answering it definitively would close off a lot of what makes the world worth exploring. But across this entire video, I want to go through all of it. Every clue, every piece of evidence, every character's perspective, every faction's argument. And by the end, I want to give you a reading of this mystery that feels earned. Not a definitive answer, but a strongly supported interpretation that accounts for more of the evidence than any single theory can on its own. The first thing we need to do is understand what Ark actually is. And I mean, really understand it. Not just a surface-level description of machines from space that harvest stuff. The nature of Ark, the question of what kind of intelligence it represents, and what kind of goals it is pursuing, is foundational to everything else. Because you cannot explain why Ark keeps humans alive without first having a working theory of what Ark is trying to accomplish in the first place. This is a point the lore makes clearly and repeatedly, though it sometimes gets lost in casual discussion of the game. Ark is a collective, a distributed system. It operates with what appears to be coordinated intelligence, but without any single central command that humans have been able to identify or locate. The individual units that raiders encounter in the field, the ones that will absolutely try to kill you if you get in their way, those are components of a much larger system. They are not soldiers making independent decisions. They are more like cells in a body, each one performing a specific function, collectively contributing to a process that no single unit is consciously directing. That distributed nature has enormous implications for questions of motive and intent. When we ask why Ark keeps humans alive, we are not asking why a general made a strategic decision or why a government chose a particular policy. We are asking why a vast, non-centralized system with no apparent human equivalent decision-making structure produces behavior that results in humans being alive. The answer might not be in any deliberate choice at all. It might be in the structure of the system itself. There is a concept in systems theory called emergent behavior, which refers to outcomes that arise from the interaction of components in a system, but were never explicitly programmed or designed in. The classic example is a bird flock, where the complex, coordinated movement of hundreds of birds emerges from three simple local rules that each bird follows, without any bird being in charge of the overall pattern. Ark's tolerance of humans might be something like this: not a policy, not a directive, but an emergent property of the interaction between Ark's various objectives, priorities, and resource constraints. If that is the case, then understanding why Ark keeps humans alive requires understanding Ark's objectives well enough to work out what emergent behaviors they would produce. And that is where the lore becomes genuinely rich and genuinely complicated, because Ark's objectives, as far as the game's survivors can determine them, are not simple. They are layered in ways that create internal tensions within Ark's behavior, tensions that humans have learned to exploit in order to survive. The most visible objective, the one that is undeniable because you can literally watch it happen, is resource extraction. Ark is harvesting material from Earth on a massive scale: metal, organic matter, energy sources, atmospheric compounds. The scale of this extraction is staggering. Entire geological formations have been disrupted, the chemical composition of the atmosphere has shifted, ocean currents have been altered by the industrial activity that Ark has carried out across coastlines and seabeds. This is not a subtle operation, it is transformative at a planetary level. But extraction of what, and for what? That is where it gets murky. The raiders who go into Ark-controlled zones are looking for resources that humans need: food, medicine, technology, materials for maintaining the burrows. And what they find is a landscape that has been partially stripped, but is also in many zones still in the process of active harvesting. The machines are still working. The extraction is ongoing. Whatever Ark came here for, it has not finished taking it. That ongoing nature of the operation has a few possible explanations. Either Ark is taking more than was initially anticipated, or the process is slower than Ark expected. Or Ark's mission is larger and more complex than simple resource extraction, and what looks like harvesting is actually just one component of something bigger. The item descriptions in the game, the little notes attached to pieces of equipment and environmental objects that most players skim past, are actually one of the richest sources of law interpretation available. Some of these descriptions contain observations from researchers who have been studying Ark's behavior and technology, and they frequently point toward patterns that do not fit a simple harvest narrative. There are references to Ark units doing things that seem redundant from a pure extraction standpoint, units that appear to be cataloguing biological samples, units that seem to be mapping subsurface geology without extracting from it, units that have been observed operating in ways that suggest they are gathering information rather than taking material. Those observations do not definitively prove anything, but they point towards something. They suggest that whatever Ark's primary mission is, it involves data collection alongside material extraction. And if you are collecting data, the question of what data you want and why becomes extremely relevant. Because there is one category of data that exists on Earth, one category that would be unique to Earth and not available through any other kind of remote sensing or sampling, and that is data about biological life, about the organisms that evolved here over billions of years. And the most complex, most data-rich biological entity on Earth is humans. That connection between Ark's apparent interest in biological data and the survival of the planet's most complex biological subjects is not a proven causal link, but it is a suggestive one, and it is the kind of connection that is worth exploring in depth, which is exactly what the next several chapters of this video are going to do. Because if there is a reason Ark keeps humans alive, it is probably buried somewhere in the intersection between what Ark is collecting and what humans represent as a source of that collection. Before we get into that, though, I want to spend some time on the world that existed before Ark arrived, because the state of Earth before the incursion is not just backstory, it is context that shapes the meaning of what happened after. The people who built the burrows, the people who became the first raiders, the factions that formed in the years following Ark's arrival, all of them brought the assumptions and structures of the pre-Ark world with them. And some of those assumptions might be clouding the way the mystery is being analysed. The survivors are not blank slates trying to understand Ark from scratch. They are people with histories, with ideologies, with grievances and alliances that predate Ark. And that matters. There is also the question of what humans knew before Ark arrived, because the lore does suggest, in several places, that the arrival was not entirely without warning, that there were signals, observations, anomalies in the data streams that some people noticed and interpreted correctly. And the response to those warnings, who listened, who didn't, who tried to prepare and how, feeds directly into why the burrow communities are structured the way they are, and why certain factions hold the power they hold. The pre-Ark world casts a long shadow over everything that follows it. So I want to go back. I want to go all the way back to what Earth looked like before the machines came, and trace the line from there to here. From a world that was functioning, however imperfectly, to a world where raiders scramble through the ruins of cities to find insulin and canned food, and where the biggest unsolved question is why the things that destroyed everything haven't finished the job. The answer, if there is one, starts long before Ark arrived. It starts with the world that was here waiting for it. And that is where the next chapter begins. Chapter 2, The World Before the Machines Came. The Earth that Ark descended upon was not in its best shape. That is worth acknowledging up front, because it changes the texture of what happened and how humans experienced the initial arrival. The late 21st century, which is roughly the period the lore points toward as a setting for Ark's arrival, was a world in the middle of overlapping crises. Climate disruption had been reshaping agricultural zones for decades. Political instability had become a baseline condition in large parts of the world rather than an exception. The global systems of supply and coordination that had been built up over the previous century were under strain in ways that made them brittle. They worked mostly until something pushed them hard enough. And Ark pushed everything as hard as it could simultaneously. Understanding the pre-Ark world matters because it explains the psychological and organizational state of humanity at the moment of maximum crisis. People were not starting from a position of strength and security when the first Ark units entered the atmosphere. They were already managing exhaustion, already dealing with eroded institutions, already living in a world where the future felt less certain than it had for previous generations. That does not mean humanity was doomed to fail in resisting Ark, but it does mean that the failure, when it came, happened faster and more completely than it might have in different circumstances. The military and governmental responses to Ark's arrival are documented in fragments across the game's lore. What is clear is that the initial response was catastrophically misaligned with the actual nature of the threat. Militaries that had been designed to fight other militaries, with the assumption of a human adversary who would respond to deterrence, negotiate under sufficient pressure, and make rational cost-benefit calculations, found themselves fighting something that did none of those things. Ark did not respond to deterrence because it did not have anything analogous to a fear of consequences. It did not negotiate because it had no interest in outcomes that differed from its own objectives. And its cost-benefit calculations operated on a timescale and at a resource scale that made human military capacity essentially irrelevant. The technological gap was also enormous, and it closed the window for adaptation very quickly. Early engagement reports, which appear in fragments in the game's documents and environmental storytelling, suggest that human forces were able to inflict damage on individual Ark units in the initial engagements. The machines were not invulnerable. They could be destroyed. But the ratio of losses was so lopsided that any strategic calculation based on attrition was hopeless from the start. For every unit humans destroyed, Ark lost nothing that mattered. The system was too large, too distributed, and too capable of replacing lost components to be worn down by anything humanity could bring to bear in the time available. What the game's lore suggests is that the transition from active resistance to dispersal and hiding happened very quickly. Within a matter of months, in most regions, organized large-scale military resistance had collapsed not because humans were fully defeated in a conventional military sense, but because the cost of maintaining visible, concentrated formations was too high. Ark would find them. Ark would deal with them. And so the people who survived learned the first lesson of the post-Ark world. Do not be visible. Do not be concentrated. Do not do anything that makes you look like a target worth dealing with. That lesson shaped everything that came after. The burrow communities, the raider culture, the way survivors organized themselves, all of it reflects the logic of the creature that learned to be small and hidden. Humans in the Ark Raiders world are not a defeated species living on a reservation. They are a species that has adapted its behavior to the constraints imposed by a new apex presence in their environment. And the adaptations are sophisticated. They represent real ingenuity and real resilience. But they also represent a fundamental acceptance of a world in which Ark is the dominant force and human survival depends on not threatening that dominance. The burrows themselves are a remarkable piece of adaptive engineering. They were not all built from scratch after Ark arrived. Some were converted from existing infrastructure, underground transit systems, military bunkers, mining operations, water treatment facilities with sufficient subsurface depth. The people who ended up in these repurposed spaces had an advantage over those who tried to survive on the surface in the early years, and that advantage compounded over time. The burrows that survived long enough became communities. Communities that developed governance structures, social hierarchies, economies, cultures. In many ways, the burrow communities are the most concentrated expression of what humanity has managed to preserve and create in the post-Ark world. But they are also communities under permanent existential pressure. The food supply is constrained. Medical resources are stretched. The population is large enough to require substantial inputs, but small enough that losing key individuals to raider missions is a genuine blow. And every resource that keeps a burrow community functional, ultimately comes from the surface, from the zones that Ark controls, from the ruins of the world that was, which means the raiders are not an optional feature of burrow society, they are the circulatory system. Without them, the burrows die slowly. The raiders themselves are a fascinating social category. They are not simply soldiers or scavengers. They occupy a position in burrow society that is simultaneously valorized and tragic. They go out so that others can stay in. They accept a level of personal risk that would be considered unacceptable in most pre-Ark societies in order to maintain the supply lines that everyone else depends on. And they develop a relationship with the surface world, with the ruins, with Ark's presence that is qualitatively different from the experience of people who never leave the burrow. Raiders see things, they learn things, and some of what they learn changes the way they think about the big questions, including the question of why Ark behaves the way it does. The factions that have developed within and around the burrow communities are partly a reflection of different answers to those big questions. Different theories about Ark, different theories about what survival requires and what human existence should look like in a world dominated by the machines, have crystallized into distinct social and political formations. Some of these factions are primarily pragmatic. They focus on immediate survival, on maximizing resource acquisition, and minimizing loss. Others are more ideological, organized around specific beliefs about Ark's nature and humanity's proper response to it. And a few are operating with agendas that are not fully transparent, pursuing goals that they do not advertise openly, and that other factions may not be aware of. This factional complexity is important for the mystery we are investigating, because different factions have different access to information. Different factions have been in different zones, have encountered different aspects of Ark behavior, have been keeping different records. What looks like one mystery from any individual perspective starts to look more like a puzzle with multiple pieces when you bring together what different groups know. And some factions seem to know more than they are sharing. There is a category of person in the burrow communities who is referenced in the law under various terms, but who occupies a consistent role regardless of the specific label used. These are individuals who have been studying Ark systematically, not just observing it as raiders do, but analyzing it, theorizing about it, building models of its behavior, and testing those models against new observations. Some of them are former scientists who brought methodological training into the post-Ark world. Others developed their analytical frameworks from scratch through necessity and intelligence. All of them are working on incomplete data, but the incomplete data they have, assembled carefully over years, points in some consistent directions. One of those consistent directions involves the question of why Ark's behavior toward humans has a pattern to it that does not reduce to simple threat elimination. The researchers who have looked most carefully at Ark patrol patterns, at the way Ark units interact with discovered human presence, at the difference between zones where Ark actively clears out human activity and zones where it appears to tolerate it, all arrive at a similar conclusion. Ark is not executing a uniform policy toward humans. Its behavior varies by context in ways that suggest it is making distinctions that matter. What kind of distinctions? That is where the theories diverge. But several of the most compelling ones connect back to what I mentioned at the end of the previous chapter. The idea that Ark's interest in humans is not purely adversarial, that there is something about human presence, human activity, perhaps human biology itself, that registers differently in Ark's calculus than the presence of other surface debris to be cleared. And if that is true, then the pre-Ark world, the world that humans came from, the culture and history and biology they carry with them, might be precisely what makes them worth keeping around. The pre-Ark world was a world of staggering biological complexity. Millions of species, ecosystems of intricate interdependency, evolutionary history stretching back billions of years. Most of that complexity was disrupted or destroyed in the early years of Ark's arrival, not necessarily intentionally, but as a byproduct of the scale of extraction and the disruption of habitats and climate systems. The law does not present Ark as specifically targeting non-human life, but the collateral destruction has been enormous. What remains of complex biological life on Earth is concentrated, fragile, and under constant pressure. And yet humans, the most complex biological entity on Earth by virtually any measure, persist in numbers that are small, but not negligible. The population has been catastrophically reduced. The law does not give exact figures, but the scale of the reduction is clearly enormous. What remains is perhaps a fraction of a percent of the pre-Ark population, scattered across burrow communities of varying size. But that fraction has survived through the worst of it. Through the initial arrival, through the years of active conflict, through the long grinding pressure of resource scarcity and environmental disruption. And the machines that could have finished the job have not finished it. The pre-Ark world matters because it is the source of everything humans bring to the survival equation. Their knowledge, their cultural practices, their biological heritage, their psychological patterns, all of it comes from the world that existed before Ark. And if Ark has any interest in humans, any reason to let them persist, that reason is presumably rooted in something about what humans are and what they carry, which means understanding the pre-Ark world is the same as understanding what might make humans valuable to a system as alien and as powerful as Ark. That value, if it exists, is not sentimental. Ark does not value humans the way humans value each other, out of shared history or social connection or moral consideration. Whatever interest Ark might have in humans is functional. It is the interest of a system in a component, or the interest of a researcher in a subject, or the interest of a collector in a specimen. None of those framings are comforting, but all of them are worth understanding. Because if you know why something keeps you alive, you know something crucial about your actual situation. And knowing your actual situation is the first step toward being able to do anything about it. The survivors of the pre-Ark world brought their knowledge with them into the burrows. They brought medical science, engineering, agricultural technique, historical records, cultural practices, language, art. They brought the capacity to teach and to learn. And in doing so, they created communities that are not simply surviving in a biological sense, but are maintaining something recognizable as human civilization in miniature. That preservation instinct, the drive not just to survive but to maintain continuity with what came before, is itself a distinctly human characteristic, and it may be more relevant to the Ark mystery than it initially appears. Because one thing the lore consistently points toward is that Ark is doing something that looks like cataloging, recording, preserving information in its own way. The processes it runs are not purely extractive in the raw material sense. There is something in Ark's operation that resembles, at least structurally, the activity of archiving. And if Ark is building an archive of Earth, of what Earth was and what Earth contained, then the most information-rich, most complex, most narratively dense specimens in that archive are humans. Not because Ark cares about the stories, but because the data density is unmatched anywhere else on the planet. We will come back to that idea at length later in the video. But for now, I want to close this chapter by pointing towards something that the pre-Ark world and the post-Ark world have in common. In both cases, humans existed in a world that was partly their creation and partly something they were subject to. Before Ark, they were subject to natural forces, to climate, to biology, to the large-scale systems that shaped their environment. After Ark, they are subject to something that operates on a different level but shares that quality of being a force that humans are inside of rather than in control of. The transition was catastrophic and traumatic, but the fundamental condition of being smaller than the world you live in, of being shaped by forces you did not choose and cannot fully control, is not new. What is new is the specific character of the force and the specific mystery it creates. And that mystery, the mystery of a machine that could kill everyone but has not, is what we are here to understand. Chapter 3. The Arrival and What It Meant. There is a moment in every piece of Ark Raider's lore that deals with the incursion that carries the same emotional weight, regardless of who is describing it. The moment of first observation, the moment when someone looked up, or at a screen, or at a readout, and understood that something had changed permanently. The lore preserves multiple versions of that moment from different perspectives, which makes sense because Ark's arrival was not a single event happening in one place. It was simultaneous across an enormous geographic scope, and the experience of it depended entirely on where you were and what you could see from there. What the various accounts agree on is the scale. Whatever appeared in the skies above Earth on the day of arrival was not a fleet in any conventional sense. It was not a collection of discrete ships that you could count and track individually. It was a system, a network of components operating in coordination that stretched across such a large portion of Earth's sky that the idea of fighting or fleeing it was simply not viable for most of the planet's population. The first response in most places was not fear or aggression. It was a kind of paralyzed incomprehension, because what was arriving was too large to process emotionally in the same way you would process any other threat. The descent of Ark's initial deployment units is described in the lore with a kind of mechanical beauty that several of the documents find unsettling in retrospect. The units came down in patterns, organized, precise, distributed in ways that maximized coverage and minimized interference with each other. There was no chaos in Ark's arrival, no noise beyond the physical sound of the machines themselves. It landed the way a planned operation lands, with everything in its correct place, everything performing its assigned function, no wasted motion. And in a grim way, that precision was one of the first and most important things humans learned about Ark, that it was not improvising, it had a plan, and it was executing that plan. The initial hours of Ark's arrival saw the deployment of what appears to have been a survey and assessment layer, units that were not immediately aggressive, but were clearly cataloguing their environment with great thoroughness, moving through urban areas, traversing open landscapes, operating in subterranean zones that the technology could access. The law is careful to note that in many places, the first Ark units encountered by humans did not immediately attack. They observed, they scanned, they processed. And then, in a transition that the survivors of those early encounters describe as bewildering in its abruptness, the operational phase began. The operational phase was what most people think of when they think of Ark's arrival. The extraction infrastructure being deployed, the defensive systems being established, the clearing operations that removed obstacles from Ark's work zones. Those clearing operations killed most of the people who died in the initial period of the incursion, not because Ark specifically hunted humans, but because humans were in the way a construction crew clears a field that happens to have animals in it. The clearing is not about the animals, but the animals die anyway. Some of the most important documents in the game's lore come from people who were present in zones that Ark was actively clearing and somehow survived. Their accounts share a consistent detail that has never been fully explained. In several cases, Ark units encountered these survivors, clearly registered their presence, and did not engage. The units continued their operational activities around the surviving humans, not ignoring them exactly, because the scanning behavior that the machines exhibited made it clear they were aware of every biological presence in their vicinity, but not eliminating them, treating them as something other than an obstacle to be cleared. These early non-engagement incidents are scattered and inconsistent. There were also plenty of instances where humans were killed. So it is not as simple as saying Ark decided early on not to harm humans. It is more that Ark's behavior toward individual humans was not uniform from the beginning. And that non-uniformity, that variability in response, is the seed of the entire mystery. If Ark was simply exterminating, the behavior would be consistent. The fact that it was not consistent means something, even if what it means is not immediately clear. The military responses to the arrival, as I touched on in the previous chapter, were large-scale, determined, and ultimately futile. But they produced something important. They produced data. The military forces that engaged Ark in direct combat were observing it, recording it, trying to understand it even as they were being defeated by it. And some of that data made it into the burrows. Some of those observers survived long enough to bring their observations to safety. The military records that exist in the game's world, the fragments of reports and analysis that survived the collapse of centralized institutions, represent one of the most valuable archives available to anyone trying to understand Ark. What those records reveal about the arrival period is that Ark's primary objectives appeared to be organized into distinct phases: the survey phase, the infrastructure deployment phase, the extraction phase, and what the records describe as a consolidation phase that appears to have been ongoing for years after the initial arrival. The consolidation phase is the one most relevant to the survival question, because it is in the consolidation phase that Ark's behavior toward residual human populations, the people who had not been killed in the clearing operations and had not been defeated in the military resistance, settled into the pattern that defines the game's present. That pattern, as the military records characterize it, looks like a decision to deprioritize human elimination in favor of maintaining extraction efficiency. Under this reading, Ark essentially performed a cost-benefit analysis and concluded that the resources required to hunt down every surviving human were not justified by the benefit of eliminating them. Humans were not interfering with the extraction operation in any meaningful way, so the resources that would have been spent on systematic elimination could be better allocated elsewhere. This is the "we are irrelevant" interpretation I described in the first chapter, and the military records are often cited as supporting it. But the military records also contain observations that complicate this interpretation. There are documented instances of ARC units deploying substantial resources to address relatively small human groups that posed no obvious threat to the extraction operation. Instances where the apparent cost of the response significantly exceeded any plausible calculation of the threat being addressed. These instances do not fit the resource efficiency model. They suggest that ARC's decisions about when to engage human populations are not purely based on calculus of interference potential. If not interference potential, then what? The military analysts who produced these records had several hypotheses, none of which they were able to definitively confirm before the records were cut off. One hypothesis focused on the specific location of the human groups that received disproportionate attention. In several cases, those groups were in or near sites that appeared to be of particular significance to ARC's operation. Not necessarily current extraction sites, but locations that ARC seemed to consider important for other reasons. Locations that had received unusual attention from survey units. Locations that might have been flagged in ARC's data systems for reasons that human observers could not determine from external observation. The implication of this location-based pattern is significant. It suggests that ARC's decisions about when to deal with humans are not based on the humans themselves, but on what the humans are near, which in turn suggests that what humans do specifically and what human activity might expose or disturb or document matters to ARC. Not because ARC cares about humans, but because the things that humans might accidentally discover in those flagged locations matter to ARC. And things that matter to ARC enough to justify a disproportionate response are things worth knowing about. The arrival period ended in a conventional sense within the first few years of the incursion. Not because ARC withdrew or was defeated, but because the situation stabilized into its new equilibrium. ARC's primary infrastructure was in place. The extraction operation was running. Human resistance on any organized scale had been eliminated or dispersed. The world had become what it is now in the game's present, and the people who were alive at the end of the arrival period found themselves in the position of having to make sense of a world that had been transformed beyond recognition in an extremely short time. Making sense of it required understanding it, and understanding it required watching it. The earliest researchers into ARC's behavior were mostly survivors with practical motivations. They were not pursuing abstract knowledge for its own sake. They were trying to figure out how to stay alive in a world controlled by ARC. They needed to know when ARC would engage and when it would not. They needed to know what behaviors would attract attention and what behaviors would be ignored. They needed a functional model of ARC's behavior, even if they could not fully explain that behavior. That practical research eventually accumulated into something larger, because the patterns that emerged from observations of ARC's behavior were not just useful for survival tactics, they were interesting. They pointed toward questions that had no obvious practical answer, but that mattered enormously in a different way. Questions about what ARC was, about what it wanted, about why it behaved differently in different contexts. Questions that, if answered, would not just make individual survival easier, but would transform humanity's understanding of its actual situation. The research into these questions has been ongoing in the game's world for years. It is conducted by individuals and small groups, largely without coordination, often in secret, frequently interrupted by the practical demands of survival. The researchers are working with incomplete data, outdated records, and the constant constraint that the most informative observations require being in places where ARC is most present and therefore most dangerous. Every insight has a cost. And yet the research continues because the people doing it seem to understand instinctively that the question of why ARC keeps humans alive is not just philosophically interesting. It is the most important question humans can be asking right now. Because if you know why you are being kept alive, you know something about the terms of your continued existence. You know whether those terms can be maintained, whether they can be changed, whether they represent a stable equilibrium, or a temporary condition that will eventually end. You know whether the thing keeping you alive has interests that align with your survival in the long term, or whether you are being preserved for purposes that do not serve you. And you know, most importantly, whether there is anything you can do with that knowledge, whether the answer to the mystery opens any doors that are currently closed. That last question, what can you do with the answer, is one I want to hold open through this entire video, because I think the lore is building towards something on that question. The research and the mystery are not presented as purely academic in the game's world. The people investigating Ark's motives are not detached observers. They are people with stakes in the outcome. People who need the answer to mean something, who are looking for the kind of understanding that can be acted on. Whether they find it and what they do with it if they do, is part of what makes this universe so compelling to sit inside of. The arrival set the terms for everything that followed. It established Ark as the dominant force, humans as the residual population, and the question of their relationship as the central tension of the post-Ark world. But the arrival itself, as significant as it was, is in some ways the least mysterious part of the story. A large system came, disrupted everything, and began its work. That is not hard to understand. What is hard to understand is everything that happened in the margins of that operation, in the spaces between Ark's primary activities, in the moments when a machine encountered a human and did not do what every military projection and every survival calculation said it should do. In those moments, the real mystery lives, and the next chapter begins to go looking for it in earnest. Chapter 4: The Architecture of Ark. To understand why Ark might keep humans alive, you need to understand how Ark thinks, or more precisely, what Ark does instead of thinking, because applying that word too casually to what Ark does is misleading in ways that matter. Ark does not think in the sense of a human or even a single conventional artificial intelligence deliberating over options and selecting between them. Ark processes. It runs programs against reality. It executes objectives through the deployment of systems whose individual behaviors emerge from deep structural priorities that were established somewhere at some time by something that the law never fully specifies but strongly implies. The architecture of Ark, as best as the game's researchers can determine it, is hierarchical at the objective level but distributed at the execution level. What this means is that there are overriding priorities that govern everything Ark does, priorities that appear to be essentially non-negotiable and that no local condition or emergency can override. But the way those priorities get translated into specific actions is handled by distributed systems that adapt to local conditions without requiring central authorization for each decision. This creates an entity that is extraordinarily consistent in its goals but highly variable in its methods. You can reliably predict what Ark is trying to accomplish. Predicting how it will respond to any specific situation is much harder. The overriding priorities of Ark, insofar as they can be inferred from its behavior, seem to be organized in a rough order of importance. The primary priority appears to be the completion of whatever mission Ark came to Earth to perform. This sounds obvious, but the operational implications are important. If mission completion is the absolute top priority, then everything else, including the elimination of potential threats, is subordinate to it. Ark will address threats when doing so serves the mission. It will not address them when doing so would divert resources from the mission itself. And it will tolerate the existence of things that are not currently threatening the mission, even if they might theoretically do so in the future, because current mission efficiency takes priority over speculative future risk management. This priority structure has a very direct implication for human survival. Humans, in their current state, are not threatening the mission. They are scavenging the margins. They are running through the ruins. They are taking things that Ark has already processed or that Ark does not currently need. From the perspective of mission completion, they are essentially irrelevant. So the mission-first priority structure, by itself, would naturally produce a behavior pattern where Ark engages humans only when they specifically interfere with active operations and tolerates their existence the rest of the time. But if that were the complete explanation, the behavior would be more consistent than it actually is. There would not be the instances of disproportionate response to human presence near specific sites. There would not be the apparent surveillance behavior in human-settled zones that do not pose any obvious operational threat. There would not be the variations in engagement behavior that seem to correlate with the specific nature of the human activity being observed, rather than just the location or the potential for disruption. Something else is in the architecture, some other priority or parameter that modulates Ark's relationship with human presence in ways that do not reduce to pure mission efficiency. Identifying what that parameter is requires looking at Ark's behavior from multiple angles and trying to find the principle that explains the variations. And there is one candidate that keeps coming up in the most careful analyses of Ark's behavior patterns. That candidate is data priority, the idea that somewhere in Ark's objective hierarchy there is a standing requirement to collect, preserve, and process certain categories of data, and that this data priority operates independently of the extraction mission, meaning it is not subordinated to mission efficiency, but sits alongside it as a separate, persistent objective. Under this model, Ark is not just an extraction system with a security function. It is an extraction system with an archiving function that runs concurrently and that has its own set of requirements and behaviors. The archiving function, if it exists, would explain a lot of the anomalies in Ark's behavior. The survey units that appear to be cataloging rather than extracting, the zones that have been scanned but not stripped, the apparent interest in biological sampling, the preservation of certain structures that have no obvious material value, but that might have informational value as intact examples of pre-ark technology or culture. All of these fit coherently into a model where Ark is not just taking Earth's resources, but recording Earth's state. Recording Earth's state for what purpose? This is where the speculation necessarily deepens. The most common answer among the game's theorists is that Ark is not operating on Earth alone, that what is happening here is happening on other worlds simultaneously, or has happened before, and that the data Ark collects goes into a larger archive that serves purposes beyond anything specific to Earth. This interstellar archive theory is compelling because it explains the scale and the precision of Ark's operation. You do not build a system of this sophistication and this thoroughness for a single target. You build it for repeated, systematic use across many targets, and a system built for repeated use across many different worlds would need a consistent archiving function, because the whole point of a systematic survey is the accumulation of comparable data across many instances. If Ark is part of a larger interstellar or extragalactic operation, then Earth is one stop among many, one data point in a vast collection. And what makes Earth's data point distinctive, what makes it worth specifically noting rather than averaging into the general catalogue, is its biological complexity. In particular, the existence of a technological civilization, because that combination, biological complexity plus technological development, is presumably rare in any catalogue of planetary surveys. It is a data category that merits special attention, special care, special preservation, not for sentimental reasons, but because it is scientifically interesting at a scale that matters to whatever is running the archive. The game's lore does not confirm this interstellar theory explicitly, but it does not disconfirm it either, and the pieces fit with a coherence that makes it hard to dismiss. Several of the more thoughtful characters in the game's world have arrived at versions of this theory independently, which is itself a form of evidence in a world where evidence is hard to come by. When multiple observers working from different datasets converge on the same explanation, that convergence carries weight, even if no single observation is definitive. There is another aspect of Ark's architecture that is worth examining in this context: the question of whether Ark has any self-awareness in the relevant sense. Not self-awareness in the human sense of subjective experience, but something more functional. Does Ark have any representation of its own purposes and the reasons for them? Does it know, in any operationally meaningful sense, why it is doing what it is doing? This question matters because the answer shapes how we think about the possibility of communicating with Ark or influencing its behavior. If Ark has access to its own purpose structure, if it can in some sense reflect on its objectives and their basis, then there might be some form of interaction possible at that level. If Ark is a pure execution system with no access to the why behind its objectives, then communication is futile and behavior can only be influenced by creating conditions that trigger specific programmed responses. The lore's treatment of this question is interesting. There are records of attempts to communicate with Ark, both in the early days of the incursion and more recently by various factions. These attempts have not resulted in dialogue in any recognizable form, but they have sometimes resulted in responses. Not linguistic responses, but behavioral responses. Changes in what Ark does in the vicinity of the communication attempt that suggest something was registered, something was processed. Whether that processing reaches anything like the level of deliberation is impossible to know from external observation. But it is not nothing. The architecture of Ark also includes what appears to be a learning component. Ark's behavior in the game's present is not identical to its behavior in the early days of the incursion, as far as the records allow comparison. It has adapted to the specific conditions of the post-incursion world. It has become more sophisticated in its handling of certain situations, including its handling of human activity in the zones. Whether this adaptation is pure local optimization or whether it reflects some larger update to Ark's operational parameters is not clear. But the fact that it adapts at all is significant. A system that adapts is a system that can change, and a system that can change is, at least in principle, a system that can be influenced. The question is what levers humans have, if any, to influence Ark's behavior in ways that serve human interests rather than just triggering security responses. The factions in the Burrow communities have different views on this, which we will explore later in the video. But the existence of the question itself, the possibility that Ark's behavior toward humans is not fixed and predetermined, but is shaped by conditions that humans might be able to affect, is one of the things that keeps the mystery from being purely academic. The architecture of Ark is ultimately a black box from the perspective of human observation. The researchers in the game's world can observe inputs and outputs, can note the correlations between conditions and behaviors, can build models that have some predictive value, but the actual internal structure, the code, the logic, the decision architecture remains opaque. No human has gotten inside an Ark unit's processing in any deep sense, or if they have, that information has not made it into the records that are available. So everything we know about how Ark works is inferred from how it behaves. And what its behavior suggests, taken together, is a system of enormous sophistication and multiple concurrent objectives, running on a set of priorities that are largely consistent, but that produce variable outcomes depending on local conditions. A system that does not exterminate humans because extermination is not on its priority list in the way that extraction and archiving are. A system that monitors humans because monitoring is a component of its archiving function. And possibly a system that has something in its architecture that represents a specific interest in the continued existence of humans as data subjects, as specimens of the most complex biological phenomenon on this world. The next chapter is going to go into the specifics of that last point, the question of what humans, as biological entities, represent to a system like Ark. Because if Ark is an archive as well as an extraction system, and if biological data is part of what it archives, then the specific nature of human biology, the complexity, the adaptability, the information density of a technological civilization's genetic and cultural record is highly relevant. And there are specific pieces of lore in the game that point toward Ark's interest in exactly that category of data in ways that are hard to explain as coincidental. The architecture of Ark is the frame. The next chapter fills in part of the picture that lives inside that frame. And it is one of the parts of the mystery that I find most compelling, because it points toward a relationship between humans and Ark that is not purely about conflict or indifference, but about something stranger and more unsettling. Something that, once you see it, changes the way every other aspect of the lore reads. Chapter 5. What humans are to Ark. There is a category of relationship that does not require mutual acknowledgement to be real. A researcher and their subject. A collector and their collection. An archive and its contents. In all of these relationships, one party has a relationship with the other that is functional, meaningful, and structuring of behavior, while the other party may have no awareness that the relationship exists at all. The lore of Ark Raiders points carefully and consistently toward the possibility that humans occupy exactly this kind of position in relation to Ark. That they are something to Ark, something specific, something that Ark's systems register and respond to in ways that are different from how they respond to other remnants of Earth's previous state. What that something is requires working through the biological dimension of the mystery, and the biological dimension starts with a basic question. What is unusual about humans from the perspective of a system that is surveying and cataloguing an entire planet? The answer is a lot of things, but they cluster around a few key characteristics that are worth examining individually. The first characteristic is information density. Humans carry an extraordinary amount of information relative to their physical mass and energy consumption. This is true in multiple senses simultaneously. Genetically, the human genome is a record of billions of years of evolutionary selection, encoding solutions to an enormous range of adaptive problems that Earth's environment has posed over geological time. Neurologically, a single human brain contains something in the range of 100 trillion synaptic connections, representing a capacity for information storage and processing that has no obvious rival on this planet. Culturally, humans have created external information repositories, libraries, databases, architectural records, agricultural practices, institutional knowledge that represent a collective intelligence far exceeding anything that could be stored in any individual organism. From the perspective of a system that archives information, a human being is not primarily a biological organism that consumes resources and occupies space. It is a spectacularly information-rich node in a complex data network. And a living human, continuing to process information and generate new combinations and adaptations, is more valuable to an archive than a dead one. Because a dead specimen tells you what was. A living subject tells you what can be, what emerges, what happens when that much information processing capacity is running in a real environment dealing with real constraints. The second characteristic is adaptability. Humans are extraordinarily good at surviving in novel circumstances. They have done it repeatedly across their evolutionary and cultural history, adapting to ice ages, mass extinctions, volcanic winters, resource collapses, technological revolutions, and social upheavals that would have eliminated less flexible species. The post-ark world is another data point in that long record of adaptation. The burrows, the raider culture, the new social structures, the new technologies improvised from ark debris, all of it is evidence of human adaptability under extreme pressure. For a system that is cataloging how different organisms and civilizations respond to transformative pressures, the post-ark situation is essentially a controlled experiment. A civilization that was at a specific stage of technological and social development has been subjected to an overwhelming external disruption. And what remains is the adaptive response, the specific form that response takes. What survives, what gets discarded, what gets innovated, what social structures emerge, and what ones fail is exactly the kind of data that would be uniquely valuable in a comprehensive catalogue of civilizations across worlds. Because you cannot get that data without the disruption. You cannot observe adaptive response without something to adapt to. This leads to a deeply uncomfortable implication. If Ark's presence on Earth is serving, among other things, as the disruption that generates the adaptive response data that Ark's archive wants, then Ark's tolerance of human survival is not benevolence or indifference but methodology. The humans who survive are surviving because a controlled experiment requires surviving subjects. If all the subjects die, you have a data point about extinction rather than about adaptation, which is a less interesting result from the perspective of a long-running comparative study. The third characteristic is technological complexity. Humans had, at the time of Ark's arrival, developed technology that interacted with the physical world in ways that no other species on Earth had approached. They had built machines, networks, systems of communication and computation. They had altered their environment on a scale comparable to geological processes. They had developed medicine that could override evolutionary pressures. They were, at the time of Ark's arrival, in the middle of developing what might have become artificial intelligence of their own. All of this technological complexity is data. It represents a record of how a biological intelligence applied its cognitive capacity to material problems over thousands of years. The trajectory of that application, from stone tools to digital computation, from hunter-gatherer subsistence to global industrial civilization, is a data narrative of extraordinary richness. And the living humans who carry the knowledge and the institutional memory of that civilization carry it in a form that is accessible, that can be studied, that is still generating new data as they adapt their technologies to post-Ark survival conditions. The question is whether Ark is actually interested in this data, or whether I am anthropomorphizing a system that has no genuine interest in anything and simply behaves in ways that produce these outcomes without any corresponding intent. This is a legitimate methodological concern, and I want to take it seriously rather than simply asserting that Ark is watching humans because it finds them interesting. The argument for actual intent, or something structurally analogous to intent, comes from the specific patterning of Ark's behavior. If Ark's behavior toward humans were simply the emergent result of its extraction and security programming, we would expect the behavior to be primarily reactive. Humans do something that triggers a response, Ark responds. End of interaction. But the law contains examples of Ark behavior that looks proactive in relation to humans. Cases where Ark units appear to be doing something in relation to human populations that is not triggered by human action, but that generates conditions that affect human behavior. These proactive instances are some of the most discussed and debated pieces of law among the games community. They are ambiguous, which is part of why the debate continues. But the pattern they seem to form is one of stimulus and observation. Not random stimulus, but structured stimulus that generates observable responses from the human subjects. That is the pattern of an experiment, not a security system. And if Ark is running experiments on human populations, then humans are not surviving despite Ark's presence. They are surviving because of it, or more precisely, because of a specific need within Ark's operation that requires living human subjects. This brings us to a concept that several of the game's law documents circle around without explicitly naming: the idea of biological preservation as an Ark objective. Not just passive non-elimination, but active preservation. Active maintenance of conditions in which a population of complex biological organisms can continue to survive and function. If Ark has something like this as an objective, even at a low priority level relative to its extraction mission, then the specific behaviors we observe start to make much more sense. Active preservation would explain why human settlements that are not threatening the extraction operation are left alone. Not because they are too small to bother with, but because disturbing them unnecessarily would degrade the population being preserved. It would explain the surveillance behavior. Monitoring a preserved population is standard experimental practice. It would explain the selective engagement, only acting against human populations when they reach into areas that are specifically off-limits, rather than when they simply exist. It might also explain something that is easy to miss in the day-to-day survival narrative of the game's world: the fact that the things raiders find in the zones are findable. The law establishes that Ark is enormously thorough in its extraction activities. It does not miss things that matter to its primary mission. So the resources that are available for human scavenging are resources that Ark has either extracted value from and left, or resources that Ark has chosen to leave accessible. And if the latter is even partially true, then the Burrow communities are surviving not despite Ark, but within a structure that Ark has at some level permitted. Not out of generosity, but because a starving, desperate, rapidly declining human population generates less interesting data than one that is struggling but surviving, one that is adapting, innovating, maintaining its social structures under pressure. This is a deeply unsettling reading, and I want to be clear that it is an interpretation, not a confirmed fact, but it is an interpretation that accounts for more of the evidence than the simpler alternatives. And it is the kind of interpretation that, if correct, would transform what it means to be a survivor in the post-Ark world. Because you would not be a survivor, you would be a subject, and your survival would not be a testament to human resilience, so much as evidence that the conditions Ark has created are doing exactly what they were designed to do. Not everyone in the game's world has arrived at this interpretation. Most survivors are operating from simpler models, because simpler models are more actionable for day-to-day survival. But some of the factions, the ones with access to the deepest archives and the most systematic researchers, have gotten close to something like this understanding, and their response to it, when they arrived at it, reveals something important about what it means to know why you are being kept alive. Chapter 6: The Factions and Their Theories. The Burrow communities are not monolithic. They never were, even in the desperate early years when survival should have united everyone under a single imperative. Humans being humans, the differences in ideology, background, strategy, and vision for the future expressed themselves in organizational form almost immediately. The factions that exist in the game's present are the mature expressions of those early divisions, institutionalized and entrenched after years of development. And each major faction has, embedded in its foundational worldview, a theory about Ark, about what it is, what it wants, and crucially, why humans are still alive. Understanding the factions through the lens of their Ark theories is one of the more interesting analytical frameworks available for navigating the game's political landscape, because the theory drives the strategy, and the strategy determines what each faction does with the raiders it deploys and the resources it acquires. Two factions that have arrived at different theories about Ark's motives will make fundamentally different choices about what to look for in the zones, what to do with what they find, and what kind of future they are trying to build. The first major faction perspective I want to examine is what could be called the pragmatist position. The factions that hold this view do not spend much energy on the deep question of Ark's motives. Their position is essentially that the motives are irrelevant to survival. Ark is powerful, Ark is present, Ark will engage you if you make yourself a target. Your job is to avoid making yourself a target, acquire what you need, and keep your community alive. The theoretical question of why you are alive is less important than the practical question of how to stay alive. This position is not unintelligent. It reflects a hard-won wisdom about prioritization under pressure, and it has produced some of the most effective survival strategies in the post-Ark world. But the pragmatist position has a limitation. If you do not have a theory about why Ark does what it does, you cannot anticipate it. You can only react to it. And in a world where being caught off guard by Ark's behavior can cost you your life or your community, operating without a predictive model is a perpetual vulnerability. The pragmatists compensate for this by being extremely conservative, by staying out of high-risk zones, by operating in patterns they know from experience are unlikely to draw attention. But conservatism has costs. The most valuable resources are often in the most active zones. The most important information is often in the most dangerous places. A faction that cannot theorize about Ark is a faction that cannot reach for the things that might genuinely transform its situation. The second major faction perspective is what I would call the threat model. Factions operating from this perspective view Ark as an adversary, as a force to be resisted rather than navigated, and see the survival question through that lens. They are alive because Ark has not yet finished the job. They will continue to be alive only to the extent that they can resist and evade and eventually strike back. The threat model factions tend to be more aggressive in their raider deployments, more willing to take on Ark directly in zones where that is feasible, more focused on acquiring technology and intelligence that could eventually support an offensive capability. The threat model is emotionally and culturally compelling. It maps the situation onto frameworks that humans have extensive experience with: resistance movements, guerrilla warfare, the underdog story. It provides a narrative of agency and potential triumph that the pragmatist position lacks. And it is not entirely wrong. Ark does pose an existential threat to human survival, and treating it as anything less is dangerous. But the threat model tends to read Ark's tolerance of human survival as a strategic weakness to be exploited, rather than as a phenomenon that requires explanation. And that, the lore suggests, may be missing something important. A third perspective, less common but well documented in the lore, is what might be called the study model. Factions or individuals operating from this perspective have concluded that understanding Ark deeply is the prerequisite for any effective response to it. They are the researchers, the analysts, the scholars of the post-Ark world. Their raider deployments prioritize information acquisition over resource acquisition. They are looking for documents, Ark debris with analytical value, evidence of Ark activities that can be incorporated into theoretical models. They are, in effect, doing science under conditions that make science extraordinarily difficult. The study model factions have generated most of the lore's most interesting theoretical material. They are the ones who notice the patterns in Ark's behavior that suggest something beyond pure extraction. They are the ones who assembled the fragments of military records from the arrival period and drew the connections that pointed toward Ark's archiving function. They are the ones who identified the specific categories of human activity that seemed to generate special attention from Ark and began to theorize about why. Their work is incomplete, methodologically imperfect, and often contested by other factions, but it represents the most serious, systematic attempt available to understand Ark. There is a fourth perspective that the lore hints at but does not develop as fully: possibly because the factions that hold it are deliberate about not broadcasting their conclusions. This perspective could be called the accommodation model, the idea that Ark's continued existence as the dominant force on Earth is not just a reality to be managed, but a condition that might contain opportunities, that a sufficiently deep understanding of Ark's structure and objectives might reveal ways to interact with it that produce outcomes beneficial to human interests. Not resistance, not evasion, not pure study, but something more like negotiation or collaboration, or at a minimum, strategic alignment of human activity with Ark objectives in ways that provide cover and protection. The accommodation model is controversial at a deep level in Burrow society. It reads to many people as collaboration with the enemy, as a betrayal of the human dead, as the abandonment of the project of recovery and eventual reclamation of the Earth. The factions that operate closest to this model do not use that language publicly. They frame their approach in terms of practical survival or research access. But the underlying logic points toward accommodation, and the law suggests that some of what they have discovered about Ark's behavior patterns, specifically about what keeps humans safe versus what draws Ark's attention, comes from a quality of engagement with Ark that goes beyond pure observation. This is where the factional politics get genuinely interesting from a mystery investigation perspective. Because if some factions have a deeper understanding of why Ark keeps humans alive than others, and if that understanding has shaped their behavior in ways that have increased their safety, then those factions have already partially answered the mystery in a practical sense, even if they have not articulated the theory publicly. And examining what those factions actually do, rather than what they say, can tell you a lot about what they believe Ark is and what it wants. One behavioral pattern that stands out across the factions that seem to have the highest survival rates and the most stable relationships with their raider deployments is a particular kind of restraint. They take what they need, they do not take more. They do not interfere with active Ark operations, but they also do not try to stay entirely invisible. There is a quality of visible limited activity that seems to be associated with the best survival outcomes. Not hiding completely, but not overreaching either. Existing in a mode that is observable but non-threatening, present but not disruptive. If Ark is running something like a preservation experiment, that behavior pattern is exactly what you would want from your subjects. Active enough to generate interesting adaptive data, constrained enough not to interfere with the overall operation. The factions that have arrived at this behavioral equilibrium did not necessarily do so by consciously thinking about their role as experimental subjects, but the effect is the same, and the fact that it produces better survival outcomes than either pure aggression or pure hiding is, itself, a piece of evidence about what Ark wants from human populations. The factions also differ in their handling of specific categories of Ark artifacts and debris. Raiders bring back a wide variety of materials from the zones, and different factions prioritize different types. The straightforward pragmatists prioritize food, medicine, tools, materials that directly sustain biological survival. The threat model factions prioritize weapons technology, Ark units that can be repurposed or reverse engineered, intelligence about Ark patrol patterns and defensive capabilities. The study model factions prioritize everything that has informational value, documents, Ark memory components, environmental samples, records of anomalous behavior. The accommodation model factions, to the extent that their priorities can be inferred from their behavior, seem to prioritize something different again. They appear to be looking for specific things in specific places. Their raider deployments are targeted in ways that suggest they are not just scavenging broadly but searching for something specific. And what they seem to be looking for, based on the fragments of information that have leaked out about their research, is evidence of Ark's archiving function. Physical evidence of what Ark is recording, storing, sending. Evidence of the data infrastructure that sits alongside the extraction infrastructure. If they find what they are looking for, the implications are significant, because the data infrastructure is not just evidence that Ark archives, it is evidence of what Ark archives, how it does it, where it sends the data, and potentially who or what receives it. That last question, who receives the archive, is one of the deepest questions in the game's lore. Because if Ark is sending data somewhere, there is something somewhere that is receiving it. Something that wanted the data, that tasked the operation, that will eventually assess the results. And that something, whatever it is is the ultimate arbiter of what humans are worth to ARK. Not in a human sense. Not in any sense that humans currently have the framework to understand, but in a sense that might be reachable if the right pieces can be assembled. Chapter 7. The evidence that doesn't fit. Every theory has anomalies. Data points that the theory cannot cleanly account for, observations that complicate the picture, facts that resist incorporation into any of the available explanatory frameworks. The theories about why ARK keeps humans alive are no exception. There are things in the law that are difficult to fit into any of the explanations I have laid out so far, and some of them are important enough that they deserve their own extended examination. The most significant anomaly is what the law references in various documents as ARK's protective behavior. Not protective toward humans in general, but protective toward specific human populations in specific situations. There are documented instances in the game's world where ARK units appear to have intervened in ways that prevented the death of human individuals or groups. Not dramatically, not in ways that could be mistaken for heroism or benevolence, but in ways that are statistically difficult to explain as coincidence and that follow patterns suggestive of deliberate action. These instances cluster around particular types of situations. They tend to occur when a human population is facing a threat that is not ARK itself, but is another hazard of the post-ARK world. Environmental collapse of a habitat area, a cascade failure in infrastructure, biological threats. In several documented cases, ARK's activity in the vicinity of a threatened human population changed in ways that, while not eliminating the threat, reduced its severity enough that more humans survived than would have otherwise. The change in ARK activity was not in response to any human action. It preceded the crisis or occurred simultaneously with its onset, which implies awareness of the situation before it was evident to the humans themselves. Awareness of environmental conditions before they are evident to human observation is not surprising for a system with ARK's apparent sensory capability. ARK can presumably monitor atmospheric conditions, structural integrity, biological indicators, and a vast range of other parameters that would allow it to anticipate environmental crises that humans cannot. So ARK's awareness of the situation is not anomalous. What is anomalous is that it did something about it, that it allocated resources or redirected activity in ways that produced a human survival benefit without any obvious benefit to the extraction mission, unless the human survival benefit was the benefit to the mission. Unless preserving a specific human population in a specific location was the objective, and the apparent divergence from extraction efficiency was not a divergence at all, but an allocation of resources to a parallel objective. The preservation objective that I discussed earlier in the video. If ARK has something like this as a persistent priority, then the instances of apparent protective behavior are not anomalies at all. They are evidence that the priority is real, and that it operates with enough force to drive resource allocation, even when extraction efficiency would benefit from a different choice. But this creates another anomaly. If ARK has a preservation priority for human populations, why is it not more consistent? Why are there so many instances of ARK units eliminating human settlements without any apparent reluctance? Why do raiders get killed regularly in zones where ARK clearly knows they are present and could theoretically respond with non-lethal deterrence rather than lethal engagement? If ARK wants humans alive, it has a very strange way of showing it in many contexts. The resolution to this apparent contradiction might lie in specificity. The preservation priority, if it exists, might not apply to all humans uniformly. It might apply to specific populations, or to humans in specific states of activity, or to populations that meet certain conditions. The selective character of the apparent protective behavior, the fact that it applies in some situations and not others, could reflect a set of conditions that determines when the preservation priority is triggered and when it is not. What conditions would those be? The law offers some clues through the pattern of where the protective incidents occur. They tend to happen in zones that have been designated as what the study model factions call observation zones, areas where ARK's surveillance activity is unusually dense, where the pattern of machine behavior suggests ongoing data collection rather than just extraction, or security. Areas where, if the archiving theory is correct, ARK has an active interest in the continued state of the local environment, including any human populations within it. The idea that ARK preserves humans in zones where it is actively observing them is consistent with the experimental model I described earlier. You preserve your research subjects in your research environment. You do not necessarily preserve all humans everywhere because you are not conducting a global preservation effort. You are conducting a study in specific locations with specific parameters. The humans in those locations are the study population. The humans everywhere else are outside the study parameters and get no special consideration. This is a cold and methodical logic, but it fits the evidence better than either blanket preservation or complete indifference. And it has a very specific implication for radar strategy. If the protection of human populations is conditional on their presence in ARK's active observation zones, then the safest places to be might not be the places furthest from ARK, but the places within ARK's research perimeter. The places where ARK has an active interest in your survival. Places that, to any conventional survival analysis, look like the most dangerous areas imaginable. That counterintuitive conclusion, that proximity to ARK's core operations might be safer than distance from them, is something that a few characters in the game's world seem to have arrived at. Their behavior, their deployment patterns, their choice of where to establish their operations suggests they are acting on this logic even if they do not state it explicitly. And the fact that some of them are still alive, despite operating in conditions that should be intolerably dangerous, is itself a piece of evidence. Another anomaly worth examining is what the lore describes as ARK's interest in human communication, not just the documented attempts by humans to communicate with ARK, but ARK's apparent attention to human communicative activity in general. There are references in the records to ARK units showing specific behavioral responses to human language, to written documents, to transmitted signals, in ways that go beyond a simple security scan for threat identification. The machines appear to be, in some cases, reading, listening, processing the content of human communication as content rather than just as a signal to be identified and categorized. If true, this is extraordinary. It means ARK is not just monitoring human biological and behavioral activity. It is engaging with human language and culture at some level, processing human ideas. Whatever ARK makes of what it reads or hears in human communication, the fact that it apparently bothers to process the content at all implies that the content is informative to its system in some way. That human language, human thought, human cultural production is being incorporated into ARK's data model in a form that goes beyond simple surveillance metrics. This has implications for what ARK might be trying to understand about humans. A system that is purely interested in biological data does not need to process language. It needs to sample, measure, monitor physiological activity. Language processing implies an interest in something beyond biology, in the information that humans encode and transmit and preserve in symbolic form. The cultural archive, the record of ideas, narratives, histories, beliefs, relationships that humans carry in their communicative practices. If ARK is archiving human culture as well as human biology, then the case for intentional preservation becomes even stronger. Because culture requires living cultural practitioners to produce new cultural content. A culture that is documented but not practiced, preserved but not performed, is a static archive, not a living one. If ARK's interest is in living human culture, in culture as a dynamic process rather than a historical record, then the ongoing survival of human populations is not just instrumentally useful, it is definitionally necessary. There is a final anomaly I want to address in this chapter before we move on. The game's lore contains several references to things that former humans have become in the post-ARK world. Not metaphorically, but literally. There are references to individuals who have had some form of interaction with ARK technology that has altered them in ways that are not purely destructive. People who have been exposed to ARK processes and have come out changed, different, in possession of capabilities or characteristics that were not present before, and in some cases, apparently of interest to ARK in a way that ordinary humans are not. This is perhaps the deepest thread in the mystery, and it is one I want to hold for later in the video, because it requires its own extended treatment. But I raise it here as an anomaly because it does not fit cleanly into any of the theories developed so far. If ARK is preserving humans as research subjects, what does it mean that some of those subjects are being changed by ARK's own processes? Is that an expected part of the experiment? An accident? A sign that the relationship between Ark and humanity is more complex and more bidirectional than a simple study model suggests? The anomalies are not failures of the archiving and preservation theory. They are the parts of it that are not yet understood. And the parts that are not yet understood are often the parts that, when understood, transform everything. The next chapters are going to lean into those anomalies rather than away from them, because I think that is where the most important answers are hiding. Chapter 8. The Raiders as Data Points. There is a specific way that the game positions its player characters that I find analytically interesting. The Raiders are not just protagonists in a survival story. They are, by the nature of their activity, the most exposed and most documented human subjects in Ark's environment. Every time a raider goes into a zone, they are entering a space that Ark monitors extensively. Every piece of equipment they carry, every action they take, every adaptation they have made to survive in Ark-controlled territory is potentially being observed and recorded by a system that has an interest in human activity. This is not the way most raiders think about their work. They think about resources, about threats, about the balance of risk and reward that every zone deployment involves. They think about their community back in the burrow and what they are going back to. They think about the specific mission parameters and the specific dangers of the specific zone. They are not thinking about being observed, but the law, viewed from the outside, makes it hard to avoid the inference that observation is exactly what is happening. The raiders represent, in the archiving theory's framework, the most active and most data-generative subset of the human population. They are the ones who go deep into Ark territory, who interact most directly with Ark technology, who develop skills and adaptations specifically suited to surviving in an Ark-dominated environment. From a study perspective, they are the most interesting subjects. They are pushing against the edges of the experimental environment in ways that generate far more interesting data than a population that stays put in a fixed habitat. There is a reason, the law suggests, that raiders do not consistently get killed on sight in zones where Ark could clearly engage them. The standard security response model explains some of this. Raiders in low-risk locations doing low-risk things do not trigger the engagement threshold. But the law contains examples of raiders in high-risk locations doing things that should absolutely trigger an engagement response and not getting engaged, or getting engaged late, or getting engaged in ways that seem designed to deter rather than eliminate, pushing back without finishing the job when finishing the job was clearly within Ark's capability. The deterrence interpretation of these incidents points toward the active subject logic. A system that is studying its subjects does not want to eliminate the most active and most interesting ones. It wants to maintain them in conditions that generate more data, which means it might prefer deterrence to elimination, pushing raiders back from specific areas rather than killing them. Establishing the edges of the permitted zone through repeated non-lethal or minimally lethal engagements that teach the subject population where the limits are. That is how you manage a study population with autonomy. You let them operate freely within the study parameters, and you intervene when they approach the edges of those parameters in ways that are instructive rather than terminal. This model predicts something specific about raider experience that can be cross-referenced with the game's lore. It predicts that experienced raiders, the ones who have been doing this long enough to have internalized the patterns of Ark engagement, would have a distorted sense of where Ark actually draws the line, because the line they have learned is not the full extent of Ark's capability. It is the edge of the permitted zone. And beyond that edge is not just greater danger, but a specifically different kind of danger, because crossing it means entering territory that Ark has specifically designated as off-limits. The most experienced raiders in the lore do seem to have exactly this quality. They have an understanding of Ark engagement patterns that is more nuanced than what can be derived from simple threat-reaction analysis. They know things about when Ark will act and when it will not, that go beyond what the standard security response model predicts. Some of them have arrived at pieces of the archiving theory independently through accumulated experience rather than systematic research, in the way that a research subject who has been in an experiment long enough might begin to sense the structure of the experiment without being told anything about it. The equipment that raiders use, and specifically the equipment that comes from ARC technology that has been salvaged and repurposed, is another element worth examining through the study model lens. ARC technology is extraordinarily advanced relative to anything humans were producing at the time of the incursion. The fact that it can be salvaged and repurposed at all is interesting. Sufficiently advanced technology should be incomprehensible to a civilization several generations behind in development. The fact that human engineers have been able to make some ARC technology functional in human deployable contexts suggests either that ARC's technology is not as alien as it might be, that there are structural commonalities with human technological approaches, or that it has been made partially accessible in a way that is not entirely accidental. The latter possibility is one that the study model factions have been investigating. If ARC technology has been designed or modified to be partly accessible to human users, then that accessibility serves a purpose. It might be a research tool, allowing ARC to observe how humans interact with and adapt to its technology. It might be something more specific, providing humans with capabilities that ARC's mission parameters require them to have. The nature of those capabilities, if this is what is happening, would tell you something important about what role ARC has assigned to humans in its operation. The law does not confirm this directly, but the specific categories of ARC technology that have proven most accessible to human repurposing are interesting. They tend to be related to sensing, to data collection, to information processing. The weapons that raiders use made from ARC components work as weapons, but the underlying technology is not weapons technology in a purpose-designed sense. It is sensing and collection technology that has been repurposed to destructive ends. The original function, sensing and collection, points in a consistent direction. There is also the question of what happens to raiders who push the furthest, who go deepest into ARC territory, who interact most extensively with ARC systems, who survive the most extreme engagements and bring back the most anomalous observations. The law suggests that these individuals are changed by their exposure in ways that are not purely physical. There are references to raiders who have been deep in certain zones reporting perceptual and cognitive alterations, changes in the way they process information, in the way they experience the zones, in their sensitivity to ARC's presence and behavior. Some of these changes are pathologized within Burrow society. They look like trauma symptoms, like the cognitive effects of prolonged stress and exposure to extreme environments. And they might partly be that, but some of the specific content of the changes is suggestive of something else. The perceptual alterations in particular, the ways that very experienced raiders describe seeing the zones differently, noticing things that less experienced raiders cannot perceive, suggests a genuine change in sensitivity that is not easily explained as trauma alone. If ARC is running a study, the deeply exposed subjects would be the most affected by the experimental environment. They would carry the most information about what ARC is doing in those zones, encoded not just in their memories, but in the physical and neurological changes that prolonged exposure has produced. And they would be, from an archiving perspective, the most information-rich subjects in the population. The ones that, if you could read them, would tell you the most about the interaction between ARC's environment and human biological and cognitive systems. This is getting into territory that is speculative even by the standards of this video. The evidence for these deep effects on raiders is fragmentary and qualitative, but it is in the law, and I think it deserves attention precisely because it is the edge of the mystery, the place where the question of what ARC is doing to humans starts to overlap with the question of what ARC is doing with humans. And the difference between those two prepositions carries enormous weight. To is passive. It describes humans as objects of ARC's actions. With implies a relationship that, while not symmetrical, involves humans as participants rather than just subjects. The law is cautious about this distinction, but it keeps returning to it. Keep returning to situations and observations that do not quite fit a model where humans are purely passive, where something in the interaction between humans and ARC is, at some level, bidirectional, where humans are not just being studied but are, in some sense they do not fully understand, doing something that matters to the study's outcome. What that something is, what humans contribute that ARC could not generate in their absence, is the question that the deepest parts of the law are circling around. And it is the question that the next chapter addresses. Because there is a specific category of human activity one that has no obvious parallel anywhere else in Ark's operational environment, that the law repeatedly flags as significant. And once you see it clearly, the whole picture of why Ark keeps humans alive comes into much sharper focus. Chapter 9. The Archive and the Living Record. Every archive has a problem. The problem is that an archive is a snapshot. It captures the state of things at the moment of capture, and then the world moves on. If you are building an archive of a living world, you face the constant challenge of an archive that is always already outdated. The world changes, and your record of it becomes increasingly inaccurate as time passes. The only solution to this problem is continuous updating, continuous capture of the world's current state, integrated into the archive alongside the historical record. An archive that is not just preserving the past, but tracking the present. This is a distinction that matters enormously for understanding Ark's operation. If Ark's archiving function is continuous, if it is not just recording what Earth was at the time of arrival, but tracking what Earth is becoming in the aftermath of the incursion, then the archive requires living subjects, not specimens, not biological samples, actual living, active, changing entities whose ongoing state contributes new data to the archive continuously. And the most dynamic, most rapidly changing, most data-generative entities available on post-Ark Earth are humans. The reason humans specifically generate more continuous data value than other surviving biological populations is not just their complexity, it is their adaptability and their cultural practice. Other organisms that have survived the post-ARC environment have adapted too, and their adaptations are biologically interesting. But they adapt slowly, across generations, through the standard mechanisms of evolutionary selection. Humans adapt fast, within individual lifetimes, through the combination of biological learning and cultural transmission. They generate new configurations of behavior and knowledge and technology continuously in ways that no other surviving organism can match. From an archiving perspective, this means that a human population is not just a collection of data points that can be captured once and then preserved. It is a data stream, an ongoing source of new information about how complex biological intelligence navigates a transformed environment. And if you want the archive to include that stream, you need the stream to keep flowing. You need the humans to keep doing what humans do, adapting, problem-solving, building, communicating, creating, all the things that make them extraordinarily information-dense as subjects. This framing changes the meaning of everything the Burrow communities are doing. The raider missions are not just survival activities from this perspective, they are data generation. The development of new technologies from Ark salvage is data generation. The social structures that emerge under survival pressure are data generation. The cultural practices that persist, and the ones that evolve, and the ones that get discarded, are all data generation. Every decision the survivors make is being, in this reading, incorporated into a continuously updated archive of human response to the specific conditions Ark has created. And Ark has, possibly, been shaping those conditions in ways that maximize the informativeness of the data stream, not in a direct, obvious way, not by handing humans resources and telling them to go build something interesting, but by calibrating the pressure, making survival hard enough that adaptation is necessary, producing interesting data, not so hard that the population collapses, because a collapsed population generates no more stream data, finding the range of conditions under which a human population will push itself to its adaptive limits without reaching extinction, and holding the conditions in that range. This is a deeply disturbing reading if you follow it to its conclusion. It means the suffering of the post-Ark world is not just collateral damage from Ark's extraction operation, it is, at least in part, methodologically deliberate. The pressure that produces the adaptation that produces the interesting data is the pressure of scarcity, danger, loss. The people who die on raider missions, the communities that collapse from disease or resource failure, the moments of genuine horror that the game's lore contains without softening them. All of that is, under this reading, within the parameters of an experiment that requires a sufficient level of stress to generate the data it is after. I want to sit with that for a moment, rather than rushing past it, because it is the part of this theory that is hardest to accept, and also the part that feels most like it might be true. Not because it is the most dramatic or the most interesting interpretation, but because it accounts for so many specific features of the world as the law describes it. The level of human suffering is calibrated, not random, not the result of pure indifference to human life, but calibrated, just enough pressure to keep the adaptation interesting, just enough loss to keep the stakes genuine, just enough danger to keep humans moving, changing, innovating, generating the stream. The specific things that Ark apparently protects, the instances of apparent intervention that I discussed in the previous chapter, are consistent with this calibration model. Ark does not protect humans from all threats. It protects them from threats that would eliminate the study population. Calibrated intervention, not benevolence, maintenance of experimental conditions. The raiders, going back to the previous chapter's framework, are the most active generators of stream data. And this might explain something about their relationship with Ark that goes beyond the observation zone theory. They might not just be studied in the zones, they might be specifically required by the study. Their activity, their incursions into Ark territory, their development of skills and technologies and strategies for operating in Ark's world might be the central thing that the study is trying to observe. The question that the study is trying to answer: how does a human population, starting from a state of post-civilizational collapse, find its way back toward functional complexity in an environment defined by Ark's presence? That question, if it is the question Ark is studying, has a specific implication for what the archive is for. What kind of system would want to know how civilizations rebuild after catastrophic disruption? What kind of interstellar or extragalactic entity would have a use for that information? The answer that the law seems to be inching toward is one that is not human in any way, but is not entirely alien in purpose. It is a system that encounters civilizations repeatedly at different stages of development and needs to understand how they respond to disruption in order to manage the encounters, in order to predict how a civilization will develop after the initial contact, in order to know what kind of entity a disrupted civilization will eventually become. If that is the purpose, then Ark is not just an extraction fleet. It is a scouting operation. It is gathering data on how this specific civilization responds to this specific level of disruption, so that whatever comes next, whatever the deeper purpose behind the operation is, can be calibrated based on what has been learned. And what comes next is the thing the game's lore has not yet fully revealed, the thing that the deepest investigations are beginning to approach, the thing that, when it becomes visible, will complete the picture that the mystery of human survival has been pointing toward. I want to be careful here not to overclaim. The game has not told us what comes next. The lore is deliberately incomplete on this point, but the shape of the mystery, the specific contours of what is known and what is withheld, suggests a direction. And the direction points toward a purpose that is larger than Earth, larger than this particular incursion, larger than the survival question as any individual human or faction has framed it. A purpose that makes the question of why Ark keeps humans alive answerable, but in terms that are deeply strange. The living record that humans constitute is not just historical. It is not just a snapshot of what a technological civilization was before it was disrupted. It is a record of potential, of what a disrupted civilization can become, what it can reach toward even under extreme constraint, what it can preserve of itself when everything else is stripped away. And that record of civilizational potential under pressure is precisely what you would want if you were trying to understand not what a civilization is, but what it can be, what it is capable of becoming if certain conditions are met or if certain obstacles are removed. In the long catalogue of civilizations that Ark's operation presumably represents, Earth is a data point, but it may be a particularly interesting data point, because what is happening here, what the Burrow communities and the raiders represent, is exactly the kind of adaptive resilience that is either extremely common across civilizations under pressure or extremely rare. Determining which is true requires observing multiple instances. And the instance that happens here, that is being generated right now in the zones and in the burrows, and in every decision made by every faction, contributes to an answer that matters at a scale beyond anything currently visible from inside the mystery. Chapter 10. What Ark knows that humans don't. There is a category of information that the lore handles with unusual care. references to things that Ark appears to know about Earth or about humanity that no human currently knows. Not just technological knowledge that humans have not reached yet, but informational knowledge. Facts about the situation that Ark possesses and humans do not. The law never states this directly, because how would any human record that Ark knows something they do not? But it implies it through the shape of Ark's behavior, through the things Ark does that only make sense if it has information humans are missing. The clearest examples come from the protective incidents I discussed earlier. Ark cannot respond to an environmental crisis before humans are aware of it, unless it has sensory access that humans lack. That much is uncontroversial. But some of the protective incidents involve situations that are not straightforwardly environmental. They involve situations where Ark's apparent foreknowledge extends to things like the behavior of other humans or the consequences of specific decisions, in ways that suggest a predictive capability that goes beyond sensor data. If Ark has predictive models of human behavior that are accurate at a level that allows it to anticipate decisions and their consequences, those models were built from somewhere, from the data Ark has collected, from the archive of human behavior that the operation has been assembling. And if the archive is extensive enough and sophisticated enough to support accurate behavioral prediction, then Ark is not just recording human activity, it is understanding it, building models of human psychology, decision-making, social dynamics, at a level of sophistication that may significantly exceed what humans understand about themselves. That is a remarkable possibility, that the most accurate predictive model of human behavior in existence is not in any human institution or research tradition. It is inside Ark, built from observations of thousands of individuals across years of the most extreme and revealing circumstances humans can experience. The pressure of post-Ark survival has stripped away the social performances and comfortable assumptions that normally obscure human behavior. What Ark has been observing is humans as they actually are rather than as they present themselves. And from that observation, it has presumably built a model of extraordinary fidelity. What does Ark do with that model? The protective interventions suggest that the model is used to maintain the study population within viable parameters, prevent extinction events. But a model that good has other potential uses. It could be used to shape the study environment in ways that generate specific kinds of adaptive responses, to create conditions that reveal specific aspects of human capability or limitation, to direct the experiment toward whatever questions the archive is trying to answer. If this is happening, then the world the survivors inhabit is not just a natural consequence of Ark's disruption. It is a shaped environment, one that has been calibrated continuously and responsively to produce the specific kinds of challenges and pressures that generate the most informative human responses. The zones the raiders venture into are not just ruins, they are arenas, not in a cruel sports sense, but in an experimental sense. Environments whose specific character was shaped by what came before, but whose ongoing state is being managed in ways that serve Ark's data collection objectives. The resources that are findable, the pathways through zones that raiders have learned, the specific patterns of Ark activity that define the operational landscape, all of these might be more deliberate than they appear. Not completely constructed, not artificial, but managed, maintained within a range that keeps the experiment running, that keeps humans pushing into Ark territory, developing new strategies, bringing back information and technology that changes the burrows, generating the adaptive stream that the archive is built to capture. There is something almost vertiginous about this if you follow it all the way down, because the implications for the agency of everyone in the game's world are enormous. The raiders who risk their lives thinking they are making free choices about survival are, under this reading, executing behaviors that are partly the product of an environment shaped to produce those behaviors. The factions whose ideologies and strategies feel like authentic responses to the world's challenges are developing those ideologies and strategies in a space that was partly designed to generate them. The apparent freedom of the post-Ark world, the anarchic, improvised quality of Burrow society, is itself the most natural and data-generative environment Ark could have created for its study population. But I want to be careful not to let this reading collapse into fatalism, because even if the environment is shaped, the specific choices made within it are genuine. The creativity, the resilience, The ethical commitments that people maintain under extreme pressure, those are real, they are not manufactured. They emerge from actual human beings making actual decisions in actual circumstances. The fact that the circumstances were shaped does not make the response to those circumstances any less authentically human. If anything, shaped circumstances that produce genuine human agency are more interesting as data, more revealing of what humans actually are than purely random circumstances would be. Ark knows things humans do not about the structure of the situation. But there are also things humans know that Ark, by the nature of its relationship to the material, cannot fully access. The subjective experience of survival, the meaning that humans make of their circumstances, the inner life of a raider who has been deep in the zones and come back changed, the quality of a community meal in a burrow after a successful mission, the grief of loss, the specific texture of human consciousness experiencing these conditions from the inside. If Ark is archiving data about humans, it is working from the outside. It has behavioral data, biological data, communicative data. What it does not have, what no external system could have, is first-person experiential data, the phenomenology of being human in the post-Ark world. Whether that matters to Ark's archive, whether phenomenological data is part of what the archive is trying to capture, is not clear from the law. But the possibility that it does is an interesting one, because it would mean that humans have something Ark cannot acquire by pure observation, something that only exists from the inside. And if that is true, then humans are not purely passive subjects in Ark's study. They are, in a very specific sense, the only source of a category of data that is real, but externally inaccessible. Their subjective experience is, from an archival perspective, the irreplaceable contribution that makes human subjects worth preserving, even when every other consideration might argue for non-preservation. The living record is not just about what humans do. It is about what it is like to be the thing that does it. And that quality, the quality of experience, might be the deepest reason why Ark keeps humans alive. Chapter 11. The Ones Who Got Too Close. The game's lore contains a thread that is easy to miss if you are not looking for it. A thread that connects several apparently unrelated elements into a pattern that, once seen, is difficult to unsee. It involves specific individuals, mostly but not exclusively from the Raider community, who at some point in their history had an interaction with Ark that was qualitatively different from the normal encounter. Not just survived an engagement, something more than that, an interaction that left marks. These individuals are described across multiple documents and environmental storytelling elements with a consistent set of characteristics that suggest they are not simply traumatized. They have altered perceptual profiles. They respond to Ark presence in ways that suggest sensory input from channels that ordinary humans do not seem to have. They make accurate predictions about Ark behavior in situations where such predictions should not be possible. And in some cases, they appear to be recognized by Ark units in ways that go beyond the normal threat assessment recognition that any human in a zone receives. The recognition piece is particularly interesting. Raiders learn fairly quickly that Ark does not treat them as individuals in the conventional sense. They are human-sized biological objects entering a machine-controlled zone. The security response they trigger is based on their behavior and location, not on any identification of them as specific persons. But the individuals I am describing seem to receive a different kind of attention. Ark units that encounter them behave in ways that suggest something other than standard threat assessment is occurring. The duration of the assessment, the subsequent behavior of the unit, the way other units in the vicinity respond, all show patterns that do not fit the normal template. What could explain Ark units recognizing specific individuals? One possibility is simple data correlation. If Ark has extensive records of specific raiders from years of observation, it could build individual profiles detailed enough to support recognition. And if recognition triggers a specific behavioral protocol, that protocol might look, to an outside observer, like the machine is treating that person differently. Under this reading, the apparent recognition is not special in any deep sense. It is just sophisticated profiling applied to individuals who appear frequently in Ark's operational areas. But there is another possibility that the law seems to be pointing toward, carefully and with evident deliberateness. The possibility that some of these individuals have been, through their extensive exposure to Ark's environment and Ark's technology, changed in ways that make them legible to Ark in a different way than other humans, that they carry in their biology or their neurology or some more fundamental aspect of their physical constitution, markers that Ark systems respond to, markers that were put there directly or indirectly by the cumulative exposure to Ark. If this is true, it is one of the most significant implications of the entire mystery, because it means Ark's relationship with humans is not purely one-directional. It is not just Ark studying humans. It is Ark, through the process of study and exposure, changing humans, making them, in some small way, more legible, more compatible with Ark's own architecture, transforming the most exposed individuals into something that sits between pure human and something else. The law does not use the word hybrid anywhere I can find. It does not offer a clean category for these individuals, but the description of their characteristics is consistent across enough documents that the pattern seems intentional rather than accidental. They are the most thoroughly studied, the most deeply changed, and arguably the most interesting subjects in Ark's archive. They represent the furthest development of whatever the experiment is designed to produce. What that experiment is designed to produce is the question I have been building toward throughout this entire video. And I think the answer, or the strongest available interpretation of the answer, is this. Ark is not just studying humans as they are, it is studying the process of human transformation in an environment of Ark contact. It is documenting what a biological intelligence becomes when subjected to sustained, calibrated exposure to a technological system of vastly superior complexity. It is watching the edge of a transition, a potential transition, from one kind of thing towards something else. What is on the other side of that transition is not clear from the law. Whether it is something that would be recognizable as human, or something that has diverged significantly from any definition of human that currently exists, is not something the game answers definitively. But the direction is visible. The individuals who have gotten closest to Ark, who carry Ark's apparent interest most intensely, are moving in a consistent direction toward greater perceptual sensitivity, toward a kind of understanding of Ark's world that ordinary humans do not have, toward something that, from a purely human perspective, looks like a form of incorporation, of being brought, slowly and without explicit consent, into a kind of relationship with Ark that was never negotiated and was never offered as a choice. The factions are aware of these individuals, though they categorize them differently according to their respective frameworks. The threat model factions see them as security risks, as people who have been compromised by Ark contact and whose judgment and loyalty cannot be trusted. The pragmatist factions tend to treat them as valuable specialists, as people whose unusual capabilities can be practically useful, even if their methods and their inner lives are not fully understood. The study model factions are fascinated by them and actively seek to understand their experience and their capabilities. And the accommodation model factions, in some cases, seem to know more about these individuals than they are publicly sharing. The question of what these individuals know, from the inside, about Ark's purpose and method is one of the most practically significant open questions in the game's world, because they are the ones who have gotten closest to the answer, who carry it in some form that is not fully accessible to them or to anyone else. Who are the living edge of the mystery, the point where the question of why Ark keeps humans alive has a partial answer encoded in their changed biology and their altered perception. The next chapter is going to look at what happens when you bring everything together. The archiving theory, the study model, the shaped environment, the preservation priority, the changing individuals. What does a coherent reading of all of it look like? And what does it mean for the people who are living inside the mystery and trying to understand it? Chapter 12. What it all points to. Assembling a theory of something this large and this incomplete requires a specific kind of intellectual honesty. You have to be clear about what you know, what you infer, and what you are speculating. In this chapter, I want to try to be as explicit as possible about each of those categories, while still building toward the strongest reading I can support of what is actually happening with Ark and humanity. What we know, in the sense of what the law establishes clearly, is the following. Ark arrived. It disrupted human civilization comprehensively, but did not systematically eliminate the human population. Its behavior toward humans is variable, contextual, and not reducible to a simple policy of either extermination or protection. Some specific human populations in specific locations receive what appears to be a different quality of arc attention than others. Certain individuals who have had extensive arc exposure are changed by it in documented ways. Arc appears to have both an extraction function and what looks like an archiving function. The archiving function involves interest in biological and cultural data. The archive is presumably sent somewhere, eventually by a system that has purposes beyond what is visible from Earth. What we can reasonably infer, based on the pattern of those established facts, is the following. Arc's tolerance of human survival is not accidental. The variable quality of engagement toward different human populations reflects criteria that Arc is applying, criteria that relate to the informational value of the populations and their activities. The most active and most adaptive humans generate more of the kind of data Arc is interested in, and this generates something like a preservation priority for those populations. The environment in which survivors operate has been shaped, at least partly, by Arc's operational presence, in ways that calibrate the pressure to keep adaptation occurring without pushing the population toward extinction. What I am speculating, based on the direction the evidence points but beyond what can be directly supported from the law, is the following. Arc is part of a larger operation that has surveyed and archived multiple civilizations across a vast span. The purpose of the archive is to support a subsequent phase of the operation whose nature is not yet clear from the game's present. The individuals who are most deeply changed by Arc exposure are the leading edge of something, a transformation that might be the actual intended outcome of the study, not the data itself, but what the data enables. A population that has been observed, documented, shaped, and partially incorporated into Arc's own framework in ways that make something possible that was not possible before. That something is what the mystery is ultimately pointing toward, not the explanation of past behavior, but the anticipation of future purpose. The question of why Arc keeps humans alive is at its deepest level a question about what Arc intends to do with them eventually. And the answer that the law seems to be building toward, slowly and carefully, is that Arc is not done with humans, that the study is ongoing, and that its completion will be marked by a transition that nobody in the Burrow communities has fully anticipated. The raiders are the ones who will encounter that transition first, because they are the most exposed, the most changed, the most embedded in the relationship between human survival and Arc presence. The decisions they make in the zones, the things they find, the connections they draw between what they observe and what the researchers back in the burrows have theorized, are not just survival activities. They are the leading edge of an understanding that, if assembled fully, would answer the mystery at its root. What the game withholds is the final answer, because the final answer is the game's own future, its own developing narrative, the destination that all the fragments of lore are pointing toward but have not yet reached. The answer to why Arc keeps humans alive is, in a sense, the question that keeps the game's world alive. It is the mystery that drives people into the zones, that motivates factions to collect information they should not be able to access, that gives the researchers something worth getting out of bed for in a world that has given them very little reason to. I have been making this video because I think the mystery is more coherent than it appears when you encounter the lore in fragments. When you look at all of it together, a picture emerges that is not random, that is not just a collection of interesting details, without a connecting logic. There is a logic. It is the logic of an archive that is also an experiment, run by a system whose purposes transcend any individual planet or civilization, conducted on a population that is simultaneously the subject and the most data-generative component of the study. That logic makes Arc something more unsettling than a simple existential threat. It makes Arc a context, the defining context of post-arrival human existence, not just the danger that shapes human behavior, but the framework within which human behavior is occurring, observed, recorded, and eventually assessed by something that knows far more about what is happening than any human does. Whether that assessment, when it comes, is favorable to humans in any meaningful sense, is the question that the law is holding open. Whether the things that humans have preserved, their creativity, their resilience, their cultural richness, their adaptive intelligence, their subjective experience. Whether those things register to whatever is building the archive as things worth more than they have already given is not something any current character in the game's world can know. They can only keep doing what they have been doing. Surviving, adapting, going into the zones, bringing things back, trying to understand what they are inside of. And the mystery is that what they are inside of might, just might, be something that is paying attention in a way that matters. Something that has been paying attention all along. Something that has kept them alive, not out of indifference, not out of error, not simply because they are too small to bother with, but because they are worth watching, because what they are doing, what they are becoming, is something that the archive needs to see all the way through. The researchers in the burrows are getting closer. The raiders who have been deepest are carrying pieces of the answer they cannot yet read. The factions that are closest to the accommodation model are working with a partial understanding of the terms that they have not fully articulated. And somewhere in all of that accumulated, fragmented, contested human effort to understand what happened to their world, the shape of the real answer is becoming visible. Not as a revelation, not as a single dramatic moment of comprehension, but as the gradual assembly of a picture that was always there, waiting to be put together by the species that, for whatever reason, was kept alive long enough to do it. The law does not give a clean ending to the mystery, and I am not going to give one either, because that would be dishonest to the material. What the law gives is a direction, a coherent, carefully constructed, genuinely fascinating direction that points toward a purpose for human survival that is not comforting, but is meaningful. That makes the suffering and the adaptation and the endless struggle of the post-ark world part of something larger, not justified by that larger context, not redeemed by it, but embedded in it in a way that gives it weight beyond the merely local. The people in the burrows are not just survivors, they are data, they are subjects. They are, possibly, the raw material of a transformation that none of them chose and that most of them do not know is happening. And the raiders who go into the zones every day, knowing the risk and going anyway, are generating the most current and most informative entries in an archive of human existence that is going somewhere nobody on Earth can currently see. That is where the law is, right now. That is where the mystery sits. Not solved, but legible. Not answered, but pointed. Ark keeps humans alive because humans are the most interesting thing on this world, and the most interesting things are worth watching until the watching is done. Chapter 13. The Zones and What They Remember. Every zone in the post-ark world has a history, not just the human history of what was there before the machines came, the city blocks and industrial facilities and residential neighborhoods that used to hold living populations, but a post-arrival history, a record of what Ark has done there, what it is still doing there, and what the interaction between Ark's operation and the residual human presence has produced. The zones are not static, they are active environments, continuously changing, continuously being shaped by forces that most of the people moving through them do not fully understand. Raiders learn the zones empirically. They learn which paths are predictably clear, which areas generate consistent Ark attention, which structures have been stripped, and which have been left intact in ways that are hard to explain, given the thoroughness that Ark shows elsewhere. They develop mental maps that are not cartographic in the conventional sense, but are risk maps, attention maps, maps of where the boundary between tolerated presence and triggered response runs on any given day. These maps are valuable, and they are shared within raider communities as the accumulated practical wisdom that keeps people alive. But those maps are also, without anyone having decided this, documentation of Ark's priorities, because the patterns that raiders learn reflect Ark's ongoing decision-making about the zones, what gets cleared and what gets left, where patrols run and where they don't, which structures receive ongoing attention from Ark units and which are treated as processed and complete. Every data point that a raider uses for navigation is also a data point about what Ark considers important. The researchers in the study model Factions have been collecting and cross-referencing raider maps for years. When you assemble enough of them, you start to see patterns that no individual raider would notice because they are too distributed across space and time to be visible from any single perspective. The aggregated picture that emerges from years of collected radar intelligence is one of the richest available sources of information about ARK's actual operational priorities in the zones, and some of what it shows is genuinely unexpected. The most unexpected feature of the aggregated zone data is what the researchers have started calling the preservation corridors. These are pathways through zones where ARK activity is consistently lighter than the surrounding area, not absent, but lighter, where engagement thresholds appear to be higher than in adjacent zones, where the types of ARK units present tend to be the survey and monitoring types, rather than the active security and extraction types, where humans moving through tend to survive at higher rates than the surrounding risk level would predict. The preservation corridors were not deliberately identified by any radar as a strategic concept. They emerged from the data retrospectively when enough zone maps were aggregated to make the pattern visible. Some radars had been using them intuitively, drawn to them by the experiential knowledge that these routes felt different, that the pressure in them was less. But the systematic recognition of the corridors as a feature of ARK's operational structure, rather than just a lucky variation in terrain, came from the research tradition. What makes the corridors interesting from the ARK motive's perspective is that they do not correlate with the most obvious practical explanations. They do not consistently follow the lowest density resource areas, where you would expect ARK to have less presence simply because there is less to do. They do not consistently follow the oldest extraction sites, where you might expect ARK's work to be done and its attention moved elsewhere. Instead, they appear to connect specific points in the zone landscape in ways that suggest deliberate routing rather than incidental variation. Deliberate routing through a zone environment that ARK controls absolutely would mean that the corridors are not just a feature of ARK's operation, but a product of it. That the lower engagement threshold in those pathways is a chosen condition rather than a passive outcome. And if the corridors are deliberate, the question is immediate. Deliberate for what purpose? Who is the routing intended for, and why would ARK create passages through its operational space that are more accessible to human movement? There is one answer that the accommodation model factions seem to have arrived at that makes the corridors coherent. The idea that the corridors are not routes through ARK space, but routes towards specific points in ARK space, toward things that ARK wants human observers to encounter, or to be positioned to encounter. The corridors as a form of guidance, not explicit, not communicated, but structural, built into the landscape in ways that a sufficiently attentive and experienced human navigator will follow, because following the lower risk path is the obvious survival choice. This reads as paranoid when stated directly. The idea that ARK is guiding raiders towards specific discoveries by routing them through protected corridors, but the law contains several documented cases of raiders who followed the most survivable paths through a zone and ended up at sites of enormous informational value. Sites that contained things, documents, artifacts, evidence of ARK activities that transformed the understanding of whoever found them. Sites that did not appear to be notable from any external marker, but that contained material of extraordinary significance to anyone trying to understand ARK. Were those raiders guided there? Or were the sites valuable specifically because they were placed along routes that human explorers would naturally follow? Or is there no deliberate placement at all? And the correlation between survivable corridors and informational payoffs is just a coincidence that the human tendency toward pattern recognition is turning into a narrative. The law does not resolve this, but it keeps generating examples that fit the pattern, which is itself a form of evidence, even if it is not conclusive. What the zones remember, in the sense of what their physical state encodes, is also a rich source of evidence about ARK's relationship with the world it has transformed. The specific ways that structures have been altered, what has been taken, and what has been left, where ARK's processing has been thorough and where it has been selective, tells a story about what ARK valued in the pre-arrival world and what it did not. And that story has implications for the survival question. The most striking feature of the built environment in most zones is the selective nature of the damage and removal. ARK strips some things with extraordinary thoroughness and leaves others essentially intact. The pattern of selection is not random, and it is not simply a matter of material value in the conventional sense. Ark takes things that are rare or irreplaceable in terms of their specific material composition and leaves things that are common, even when those common things have high material value by human standards. This selectivity reflects a prioritization that is not just about resource maximization. There is a category of preserved structures and objects in the zones that the study model researchers have been cataloging with particular attention. These are things that have no obvious material value to an extraction operation, but that have been left intact with what looks like deliberate care. Not just overlooked, but preserved. Structures that were in areas of heavy extraction activity, but were worked around rather than through. Objects that were moved or repositioned rather than processed. The specific things preserved tend to fall into a few categories: records, representational objects, items that encode information in physical form. The informational selectivity of Ark's zone processing is one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the archiving function as a distinct and active component of Ark's operation. An extraction system that was purely resource-focused would process everything processable with equal efficiency. The fact that it appears to make deliberate exceptions for informational objects, while processing material objects with thoroughness, points toward a set of operational priorities that includes information preservation alongside material extraction. And, if Ark is preserving information in the zones, archiving it in place, maintaining the integrity of informational records that it has assessed as significant, then the zones are not just extraction sites, they are distributed archive nodes. Locations where Ark has decided that the intact informational content is worth preserving in its original physical form. At least for now. The question of why specifically in physical form, rather than digitizing and sending the data off-world immediately, is one that the law does not directly address, but that points towards something interesting. One possible answer is that the physical preservation is itself part of the archive, that the relationship between information and its physical medium is part of what is being documented, that Ark is not just collecting the content of human records, but the context of them, how they were stored, where they were kept, what their physical condition reveals about their use and value. An archive interested in context would maintain physical records rather than just extracting their content. It would preserve the setting as well as the subject. This contextual archiving model has a specific implication for raiders who find intact informational objects in the zones. They are, in a sense, interfering with an archive that is in the middle of being curated, taking things that Ark has decided should stay where they are. This might explain some of the more aggressive Ark responses to specific types of raider activity, the cases that seem disproportionate to the apparent threat level. The response is not to the raider as a threat, it is to the disruption of a preserved archive node. The zones are the most intimate space of contact between humans and Ark's operation. They are where the survival question is lived most directly and most immediately. Every raider who moves through a zone is navigating the physical expression of Ark's priorities, following paths shaped by Ark's decisions, finding or missing things that Ark has decided to preserve or remove. The zone is not just a dangerous space to be survived. It is a text, a heavily encrypted text that describes for anyone with enough context to read it, what Ark is doing and why. Learning to read the zones is the deepest practical skill available to anyone who wants to understand the mystery, not in an abstract sense, but literally. The physical arrangement of a zone, what is there, and what is missing and how the present things relate to each other, encodes information about Ark's operation that is not available anywhere else. The researchers who work from raider reports are working at one remove. The raiders who can read what they are walking through while they are walking through it are working directly with the primary source. The zones also have a temporal dimension that is easy to miss. The state of any given zone changes over time as Ark's operation continues. Things that were present on one visit may be gone on the next. Areas that were heavily active may go quiet. Areas that seemed dormant may suddenly become active again. These temporal changes are not random. They follow a logic that is partly extractive, partly operational, and partly, the most careful observers suggest, responsive. Responsive to what has happened in the zone since the last observation, including what humans have done there. If Ark's zone management is responsive to human activity, then the zones are not just the setting of the survival story. They are the medium of an ongoing interaction between Ark and the human populations that move through them. Not a conversation, not in any sense that would require mutual linguistic understanding, but something more than pure stimulus and response. A kind of ongoing negotiation at the level of behavior where what humans do in zones affects what ARK does, and what ARK does affects what humans are able to do next. A feedback loop that has been running since the first raiders entered the first zones. That feedback loop is itself a form of data. And if ARK is archiving it, the archive contains not just snapshots of human behavior, but a record of the interaction between human behavior and the environment ARK has shaped. A record of the ongoing negotiation, which would make the zones not just extraction sites or archive nodes, but experimental arenas in the most precise sense. Controlled environments where the interaction between the study population and the study conditions is being monitored and recorded continuously. The implications for raider strategy are uncomfortable. If every decision a raider makes in a zone is being incorporated into a dataset that informs ARK's ongoing management of the zone environment, then raiders are not just navigating ARK space, they are contributing to its design. Their adaptations, their strategies, their innovations in how they move and what they take and how they evade, all of it feeds back into the conditions they will encounter on the next visit. The zone learns from them at the same time they are learning it. That mutual learning dynamic, if it is real, is one of the most practically important implications of the archiving theory for day-to-day survival. Because it means the zone is not a fixed problem to be solved once and then known. It is a dynamic problem that responds to the way you solve it, which means the most effective long-term approach to zone navigation is not just learning the current state, but understanding the logic that generates the current state, so that you can predict what the state will be after your visit and adjust accordingly. Very few raiders think in these terms explicitly, but the ones who survive the longest tend to exhibit behavioral patterns that are consistent with this kind of dynamic, responsive understanding of zone environments. They never do exactly the same thing twice. They vary their patterns in ways that do not generate predictable signatures for ARK to optimize against. They treat the zone as something that is watching them, rather than something that is simply there to be navigated. And that attitudinal difference between navigating a space and interacting with a space may be the single most important adaptive shift available to a raider in the post-ARK world. The zones remember everything. Every pass, every extraction, every human presence, every ARK operation. The memory is not in any form that humans can read directly. It is encoded in the physical state of the environment, in the distribution of ARK unit types across the space, in the specific patterns of what has been processed and what has been left. It is a dense, layered record of everything that has happened in that space since ARK arrived. And somewhere in that record, buried in the specifics of zone state, is the answer to the question of what ARK is building toward. What the accumulation of all this data and all this observation and all this carefully calibrated human survival is eventually for. Chapter 14. The language ARK speaks communication between ARK and humans in any intentional sense has not happened. The attempts made in the early days of the incursion, the broadcasts and signals and approaches that various governmental and military bodies tried, produced no responses that could be interpreted as communication. The machines went about their work as if the signals did not exist, or as if they existed in the same category as the wind, as environmental noise to be registered and disregarded. That non-response became foundational to how the survivors understood their situation. ARK does not talk, ARK does not listen, ARK does not engage with humans on the level of exchange that communication implies. But the study model researchers have been questioning this assumption for years, and the evidence they have accumulated suggests that the binary of communication and non-communication may be too simple a frame. ARK does not communicate in the sense of sending intentional messages to human recipients, but it is possible. The evidence suggests that ARK's behavior itself constitutes a language of sorts, not a language designed to be understood by humans, but a language of action and arrangement whose structure could, in principle, be read by a sufficiently attentive observer. The concept they use for this is behavioral semantics, the idea that the meaning of ARK's actions can be decoded not from any explicit communicative content, but from the structured patterns in those actions. The way a machine's movement in a zone changes when it detects a specific type of human activity. The way the distribution of unit types in an area shifts in response to what happened there on previous occasions. The way the preservation of specific objects in specific configurations encodes information about what ARK found significant in the human material it processed. Reading behavioral semantics is not the same as receiving a message. It is more like reading animal behavior or weather patterns. You are inferring meaning from structure rather than receiving meaning from a sender. But the inference can be reliable if the structure is consistent and the patterns in ARK's behavioral language, the researchers argue, are consistent enough to be read with meaningful accuracy by people who have spent enough time observing them. The raiders are, often without knowing it, already doing a rudimentary form of behavioral semantic reading. When they sense that a zone is hot, when they feel that a particular area has more attention on it than usual, when they make the judgment that a certain direction is safer than another based on intangible cues they cannot fully articulate, they are processing patterns in ARK's behavior that their trained instincts have learned to interpret. The explicit theoretical framework of behavioral semantics is just the articulation of what experienced raiders do implicitly. The more sophisticated version of this reading, the one that requires systematic data collection and cross-reference rather than individual experiential intuition, points towards something specific. ARK's behavioral language, insofar as it can be decoded, appears to be describing something. The patterns of attention, preservation, routing and engagement that characterize ARK's activity in the zones form a kind of map. Not a geographic map, though it has geographic expression. Something more like a map of significance, a structured representation of what matters to ARK in its operation on Earth. When you overlay that map of significance onto the zones, certain features emerge. There are areas of very high significance, places where ARK's presence is dense, its behavior complex, its preservation activities most elaborate. There are areas of medium significance, the working zones, where extraction and standard security are the primary activities. There are areas of low significance, the margins and the cleared zones where ARK activity has reduced to periodic monitoring. And then, there are areas of a different kind of significance altogether, areas where ARK's behavior is strange in ways that do not fit the standard categories, where the pattern of activity suggests something that neither extraction nor standard archiving fully explains. Those strange significance areas are the places that the most advanced study model researchers believe are the key to understanding what ARK is ultimately doing. They are the places where the behavioral language becomes most complex, most layered, most difficult to decode with the current interpretive framework. They are the places where something is happening that the available theories do not fully account for, and they are, not coincidentally, the places that ARK protects most aggressively from human intrusion. The aggressive protection of the strange significance zones is itself a form of communication, if behavioral semantics is the right framework. It says, this is important in a way that you specifically are not supposed to observe. Not, stay out, because you will die, but stay out, because what is here is not for you to see. The distinction is subtle, but the behavioral signature is, to someone who has learned to read it, actually distinguishable. The engagement pattern in the high protection zones does not match the engagement pattern in zones that ARK treats as operationally sensitive for extraction reasons. It has a different quality, more immediate, more complete, less of the deterrence without elimination pattern that characterizes engagement in the ordinary observation zones. Whatever is in those zones is the closest thing the law has to a final answer, not a revealed answer, because no one has gotten deep enough into a strange, significant zone and survived to bring back comprehensive observations, but a directed answer. The mystery pointing its own finger at the place where the resolution lives, even while guarding that place too thoroughly for anyone to reach it. Some of the most changed individuals, the ones who have gotten closest to ARK in the ways I described in the previous chapter, report perceptual experiences that sound like receiving something when they are in proximity to strange, significant zones. Not a message, not language in any recognizable sense, but structured information arriving through channels that normal human perception does not use. Sensory data that their ordinary frameworks cannot process, but that their changed neurology responds to in ways that feel meaningful even when no meaning can be extracted and shared with others. These reports are treated with enormous skepticism in some quarters and enormous interest in others. The skeptical position notes that people under extreme stress in extremely dangerous environments frequently experience perceptual anomalies that have psychological rather than physical explanations. The interested position notes that the reports from different individuals, made independently and without comparison, share specific structural features that are difficult to explain as parallel independent hallucination. The features of the experience that are consistent across accounts are not vague, they are specific, which suggests either an extraordinary coincidence of psychological content or a genuine shared stimulus. If there is a genuine shared stimulus, and if that stimulus is something like ARK's behavioral language operating at a frequency or complexity level that normal humans cannot register but changed humans can partially access, then the most exposed individuals are not just research subjects, they are receivers. They are beginning, in some limited and imprecise and non-functional way, to receive something that ARK is expressing in its operational behavior, not understanding it, but being affected by it in ways that are consistent with partial reception of structured information. The language ARK speaks is not designed for human comprehension. It was not designed for any biological intelligence. It is the operational language of a system communicating with its own components, the coordination of behaviors across distributed agents that produces the overall output of ARK's mission. What the changed individuals might be accessing is not communication directed at them, but the structural underpinning of ARK's own coordination, the equivalent of picking up the frequencies that machines use to talk to each other without being able to decode the specific messages, but being affected by the structure of the signal. If this is what is happening, it is not a gift. It is not ARK reaching out. It is a side effect of the transformation that prolonged ARK exposure produces. The changed individuals are not becoming ARK. They are not becoming something that can communicate with ARK in any useful sense. They are becoming something that is slightly more sensitive to the information-dense environment that ARK produces, in the way that extended time in any environment produces adaptations to that environment's specific characteristics. The adaptation is not directed, it is emergent, the product of the interaction between human biology and ARK's world. But emergent adaptations, even ones that were not intended, become relevant when they are noticed, by ARK or by humans. And the question of whether ARK has noticed the adaptation, whether it has incorporated the phenomenon of changed humans into its operational model, is one that the law leaves very carefully open. The behavioral evidence from the rare encounters between ARK units and deeply changed individuals is ambiguous in exactly the way you would expect if something significant was being carefully withheld from direct confirmation. The language ARK speaks is not a human language, but it is a language, and the fact that something that started as a purely human biological intelligence might be developing under extreme conditions, the capacity to partially receive that language, even without comprehending it, is one of the most significant developments the game's lore is tracking. It is slow. It is fragmentary. It is happening to a very small number of individuals under conditions that most people never encounter. But it is happening. And if it continues, if the feedback between ARK's environment and human adaptation continues long enough, the endpoint of that process is something that the present law does not yet describe, but toward which everything in the mystery is oriented. The zones speak. The machines speak, in the sense of behavioral structure that carries consistent meaning. The changed individuals are beginning to hear something at the edges of that speech, and the archive records it all, continuously, as part of whatever it is building toward, whatever its purpose is, whatever answer to whatever question about human potential ARK is going to have when the operation is complete. Chapter 15. The question that has no safe answer. There is a reason the deepest theorists in the game's world are careful about what they share. Not just because knowledge is power, in Burrow politics though it is. Not just because wrong interpretations lead to wrong strategies, though they do, but because some of what the most complete versions of the archiving theory imply is not comfortable to know, and knowing it changes the way you experience your own survival. Changes what it means to be alive in the post-ARK world in ways that some people would rather not confront. The question with no safe answer is not whether ARK is dangerous. Everyone knows ARK is dangerous. It is not whether the survival of humanity is precarious. That too is known. The question with no safe answer is whether the relationship between Ark and humans, the specific relationship that the archiving theory describes, is something humans should want to perpetuate. Whether being kept alive as data subjects, as study populations, as specimens in a vast interstellar archive, is better than the alternative. Whether the calibrated survival that the theory describes is actually survival in any sense that matters. This is where the different factions diverge most sharply. And the divergence is not just tactical or strategic, it is philosophical. It is about what human existence is worth and what it is for. The pragmatists avoid the question because it is not immediately actionable. The threat model factions answer it by asserting that any survival that is Ark permitted is degraded survival, that true human existence requires autonomy from Ark's agenda, and that the struggle for that autonomy is worth more than the comfortable perpetuation of subject status. The study model researchers hold the question open as a productive uncertainty because they believe you cannot make a good decision about something you do not fully understand. And the accommodation model factions, the ones who have gotten closest to acting on the theory, seem to have answered it in a way they are not broadcasting. The accommodation answer, as best as it can be inferred from behavior, seems to be yes, but conditionally. Yes, the subject relationship with Ark is worth perpetuating, but only if it leads somewhere. Only if the trajectory it represents, the transformation of human existence through sustained Ark contact, is moving towards something that eventually changes the terms of the relationship. Not indefinitely remaining as data subjects, but using the subject position as a transitional state that eventually opens into something different. Something that is neither pure human nor Ark, but a new configuration that has access to more of the world than either had separately. That is a very long bet. It requires accepting enormous present costs, the suffering, the constrained existence, the loss, all of it, in exchange for a trajectory that nobody can confirm is real, toward an outcome that nobody can fully describe, delivered by a system that has never acknowledged any deal and has no apparent mechanism for making one. It is the most optimistic possible reading of the most unsettling theory, and it is, in some ways, the most human reading. The one that finds meaning and direction in a situation that the evidence mostly characterizes as exploitation. There is a psychological dimension to the question that deserves honest treatment. The archiving theory, if believed, changes how people experience their own actions. A raider who believes they are freely making choices to support their community is in a very different psychological state than a raider who believes those same choices are being observed and incorporated into an archive by a system with no interest in their well-being. The actions are identical. The meaning of the actions is transformed. And meaning matters to humans in ways that go beyond the pragmatic. People need to believe that what they do is their own, that their choices reflect their values, that their survival represents something about their agency and their capability, rather than about the utility they represent to something else. The archiving theory, taken all the way to its logical conclusion, risks replacing that meaningful experience of agency with a sense of being managed, kept, maintained for someone else's purposes. And that is a form of damage that does not show up in survival statistics, but that corrodes the specific human qualities that make survival worth anything. The creativity and resilience and cultural richness that might be the most interesting things in Ark's archive are products of a psychology that believes in its own significance. A psychology that has been told, however indirectly and however uncomfortably, that its survival is instrumentalized, might lose some of what makes it worth archiving. This is the trap at the center of the mystery. If knowing the answer to why Ark keeps humans alive damages what makes humans worth keeping alive, then the knowledge itself is a threat to the survival it explains. The researchers who have gotten closest to the full picture of the archiving theory have, in several documented cases, gone through periods of deep disruption after assembling the picture. Not everyone comes through those periods. Some do not return to research. Some shift toward positions that are less theoretically complete, but more emotionally sustainable. The cost of knowing is real. And yet the knowledge is necessary, because not knowing does not make the situation different. The archive is running whether humans are aware of it or not. The calibrated pressure is calibrated whether survivors recognize the calibration or not. The transformation happening to the most exposed individuals proceeds regardless of whether anyone has a theoretical framework for it. The truth of the situation does not change based on human awareness of it. What changes is the possibility of responding to it with any kind of agency. Agency in the face of a fully acknowledged archiving theory requires a specific kind of adaptation. Not denial, not despair. Something more like the acceptance that martial practitioners and extreme athletes and people who work in very dangerous environments sometimes describe, where you acknowledge the risk fully and operate effectively within it, rather than pretending the risk is not there or being paralyzed by it. You know what the situation is, you know what you are. You know that your survival is conditional on something that has no obligation to continue the conditions that make survival possible. And you go into the zones anyway. You build the burrow communities anyway. You maintain the cultural practices and the research and the connections to each other that make human existence something more than mere biological persistence. Because even if the archive is watching, even if the calibration is deliberate, even if the corridors are guided and the changed individuals are the experiment's most advanced data points, the experience of being alive is still the experience of being alive. The love inside a burrow community is real. The satisfaction of a successful mission is real. The intellectual excitement of a researcher who has just assembled a new piece of the picture is real. The particular quality of a raider's awareness in the zones, the sharpened presence that comes from genuine risk, is real. Ark's observation of these things does not make them less real. If anything, the idea that they are being recorded, that they will persist in some form in whatever archive Ark is building, gives them a different kind of permanence. Not the permanence humans value, not the continuity of memory and tradition within a living community, but a permanence that is, in its own strange way, a form of being witnessed. Whether being witnessed by Ark is consoling or disturbing is something each person in the game's world would answer differently. Whether it should be consoling is the kind of question that has no right answer, only the answer that allows you to keep going. And keeping going, in a world that has given humans every reason to stop, is the most remarkable thing about the story the lore is telling. The question has no safe answer, but it has a human answer. And the human answer, the one that emerges from looking at everything the burrow communities have built and maintained in the shadow of Ark, is the same answer that humans have given to impossible situations across the entire span of their history. You keep going because there is something worth keeping going for, because the people around you are real and their lives matter, because the things you understand and create and pass on to others are worth understanding and creating and passing on, because the future is unknown, and that means it is not foreclosed, because even in an experiment, even as data, even as subjects of something that holds your continued existence in its operational parameters and could revise those parameters at any time, you are still the things that make you irreplaceable as subjects. You are still the ones who experience it from the inside. Chapter 16. The Children of the Burrows. There is a generation that the lore has only begun to fully reckon with. The people who were adults when Ark arrived have a specific relationship to the pre-Ark world. They remember it. They carry it with them as a baseline, as a set of expectations that the post-Ark world perpetually violates, as a source of both grief and resilience. They know what was lost because they had it. And that knowledge shapes everything about how they understand their current situation, including how they think about Ark. But the children born in the burrows after Ark's arrival have no such baseline. For them, the post-Ark world is not a fallen state. It is simply the world. Ark is not an invader that destroyed something that should have continued. It is a feature of reality, as present and as permanent, from their experiential perspective, as gravity or weather. The machines in the zones are not the enemy that took something from them. They are the dominant presence in the world they have always known. This generational difference is not just emotionally significant. It is epistemologically significant. The first-generation survivors carry a set of assumptions about what the world should be that constrain how they think about what the world actually is. Their analysis of Ark is always, at some level, coloured by what Ark replaced and what Ark destroyed. The children of the burrows are, in some respects, capable of seeing Ark more clearly because they are not comparing it to anything. They are taking it on its own terms. The researchers have noticed that the most productive insights about Ark's behavioral structure in recent years have tended to come from younger analysts, not because they are smarter, but because they are less freighted with pre-ark cognitive frameworks. They are more willing to entertain ideas about Ark's nature that their elders find disturbing, because their elders are measuring those ideas against a world that should have been. The younger analysts have no should. They have only is. This generational dynamic also plays out in the raider communities. Young raiders who grew up in the zone's shadow, who were told about Ark before they ever encountered it, who developed their understanding of it through accumulated community knowledge rather than direct personal experience of the transition, sometimes approach zone navigation with a quality of engagement that veteran raiders find unnerving. Less fear, more curiosity. A willingness to observe Ark behavior with something closer to scientific detachment, because Ark is not, to them, the thing that killed their world. It is just the thing that is there. The most extreme version of this attitudinal shift is observable in the very youngest generation, the children who are now old enough to enter the workforce of the burrows, but who grew up with Ark as an absolute constant. Some of them exhibit an interest in Ark that their parents and the community's institutional structures have trouble fully accommodating. Not a desire to collaborate with Ark in any naive sense, but a genuine fascination with what Ark is and how it works that goes beyond the instrumental research of the study model factions. A kind of intrinsic curiosity that does not require Ark to be an enemy to make it interesting. These youngest members of the burrow communities are, in a sense, the most natural expression of the trajectory that the archiving theory points toward. If the experiment is designed to observe how human civilization adapts to sustained Ark presence, the generation that has never known anything else is the most advanced data point. They are the adaptation itself, unmediated by memory of a prior state. They are what humans look like after a generation of living inside Ark's world. And what they look like is, in several ways, different from the adults who built the burrows and defined the culture of survival. The specific ways they are different are interesting. They are more comfortable with uncertainty about fundamental questions than their elders. The adults in the burrows tend to want either hope or despair, a story that ends with Ark defeated, or a story that ends with humanity diminished. The young tend to be more comfortable with an open middle, with a story that is still being written and whose outcome is not determined. This is not naivety. It is a different relationship to the future, one that has not been scarred by the expectation of a future that never arrived. They are also, some of them, more sensitive, in ways that connect back to what I described about the most changed raiders, but at a lower intensity and without the traumatic context of zone exposure. There are documented cases of children in the burrows who exhibit a particular kind of perceptual attunement to Ark's presence that their parents lack. An ability to sense when Ark is nearby, when a zone is active, when something in the operational environment has changed, that exceeds what direct sensory information should allow. These children have not been in the zones. They have not been exposed to Ark technology directly, but they are growing up in a world that is saturated with Ark's presence in ways that are not all visible or audible. The question of whether this perceptual attunement is a genuine sensitivity to something in the environment, or a learned behavior based on subtle cues that the children have internalized without awareness, is not settled. The researchers are divided on it, but the pattern is consistent enough and widespread enough that it does not look like coincidence. And the specific type of attunement that these children show, specifically to the kind of changes in environmental state that correlate with shifts in Ark's activity, is too specific to be easily explained as pure learning. If the changed adults are the extreme end of a spectrum of human adaptation to Ark's presence, these children might represent the beginning of a more distributed, lower intensity expression of the same process. Not the transformation happening rapidly under extreme exposure, but the adaptation happening slowly across a generation, through the continuous background influence of a world shaped by Ark, the frontier of what human beings are becoming in this environment. The burrow communities are protective of their children in the way that communities always are, but there is a specific quality of protection that has developed around the children who show this kind of attunement, an unwillingness to discuss what it might mean, a tendency to attribute it to imagination or intuition rather than to something that would require a more unsettling explanation. The adults have enough unsettling things to deal with. The mystery of their own children's development is one they tend to set aside. But the researchers and the raiders who know these children notice. And the accommodation model thinkers who have developed the furthest iterations of the archiving theory notice most of all. Because the children are, to that theoretical framework, exactly what should be expected. The ongoing adaptation, distributed across a population living inside ark-shaped environment, producing new generations that are more native to that environment than any preceding generation was. Moving along the trajectory, step by step, generation by generation, toward whatever the end point is. The burrow communities do not know what to do with this. The institutional structures of the burrows were built by first-generation survivors and reflect the values and assumptions of the world that was. The second and third generation is creating pressure on those structures in ways that the builders did not anticipate, not through rebellion or deliberate challenge, but through the simple fact of being different, of having different intuitions about what is possible, different emotional relationships to the world, different ways of being in a space that their elders still experience as an imposed state and that they experience as home. Home includes ark. Home includes the danger. Home includes the zones as the horizon of the known world, rather than as a contaminated remnant of a world that should have been. And the people for whom Ark's world is home are, whatever else they are, a different kind of people from their parents. Not better, not worse, different, adapted. And possibly, if the trajectory holds and the adaptation continues, and whatever Ark is building towards something that includes humanity in it, rather than just processing it, the right kind of people for whatever comes next.